A sick millionaire asked the nurse to pretend to be his daughter for a day. Hours later, his wife entered the room with a lawyer. What happened next left everyone in shock. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The room was quiet save for the rhythmic hum of the ventilator and the soft electronic beep of the heart monitor. The sterile air carried a faint tang of antiseptic, mingling uneasily with the scent of fresh lilies that adorned the bedside table. Rachel Connor, her nurse's uniform crisp and neatly pressed, stood by the window of the private hospital suite, looking out at the sprawling cityscape below. Her thoughts were elsewhere, rooted in the monotony of her routine, a routine that kept her world small and manageable. The patient, Gregory Hartwell, broke the silence with a voice that was soft but carried the weight of a lifetime. "Miss Connor," he began, his tone deliberate, "I have a favor to ask." Rachel turned, startled by the fragility of the man before her. Gregory, once a towering figure in the world of finance, now lay frail and hollow, his face pale against the pristine white of the pillows. His piercing blue eyes, though sunken, retained a sharpness that unnerved her. "Yes, Mr. Hartwell?" she asked, her voice professional yet tinged with curiosity. "I need you to pretend," he said, his words faltering under the weight of his plea. "To pretend to be my daughter, Emily." The request landed like a stone in the quiet room. Rachel felt a pang of confusion, followed by a rush of indignation. Was this a joke? Her arms crossed instinctively, a shield against whatever this was. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartwell. I'm not sure I understand." Gregory struggled to sit up, his trembling hand reaching for the bed's remote control. Rachel moved quickly, adjusting the incline of his bed and offering a glass of water, which he waved away. "Emily," he said, his voice breaking, "disappeared years ago. I don't have much time left, and I want to see her, just once more." Rachel froze, the implications sinking in. She was no stranger to the bizarre requests of patients in their final days. But this was something entirely different. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm just your nurse. I can't possibly—" "I'll compensate you," Gregory interrupted, his tone growing desperate. "Money, security, whatever you need. Just let me believe, even if it's only for a little while." Her first instinct was to refuse. But as Gregory spoke, something in his voice tugged at her resolve. There was an emptiness in his words, a grief that reached deep into the unspoken corners of his life. Rachel felt an unsettling connection, a familiarity in his loneliness. She turned away, feigning interest in the lilies on the table to mask the tumult inside her. Rachel's own life was defined by loss and impermanence. Raised in foster care, she'd spent her childhood yearning for a family, for someone to call her own. Now, in her mid-30s, she led a life of quiet solitude in a cramped apartment on the edge of the city. Her only confidant was a fellow foster kid turned schoolteacher, Clara, who lived 2 states away. Trust didn't come easily to Rachel. People, she'd learned, were rarely what they seemed. "I don't know, Mr. Hartwell," she said finally, turning back to face him. Her voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't ethical, and honestly, I don't think it's fair to either of us." Gregory's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. "Fair," he repeated, a bitter smile flickering across his face. "Life has a way of making fair seem like a childish fantasy, doesn't it?" Rachel hesitated, the weight of his words pressing against her. She didn't know this man. Not really, but in his weary gaze, she saw a reflection of her own unspoken fears. The fear of leaving the world without having mattered to anyone. Gregory broke the silence again. "Emily was just a child when she disappeared. I was too busy chasing wealth to notice what mattered most. I can't change that now, but this This is my last chance to make peace with myself." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. Rachel bit her lip, wrestling with the uncomfortable mix of pity and empathy swelling inside her. She wanted to say no, to walk out of the room and leave this mess behind, but another part of her, the part that still dreamed of belonging, hesitated. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked cautiously, unsure whether she was even willing to entertain the idea. Gregory's face softened, hope flickering in his tired eyes. "Enough to change your life," he said simply. "A fresh start, free from the struggle you've endured." Rachel's heart quickened. It wasn't the money, though she could certainly use it, but the idea of a fresh start was intoxicating. Still, the price he was asking was steep. Could she really step into someone else's shoes, even temporarily, and risk reopening wounds she'd spent years trying to heal? "I'll need time to think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Gregory nodded, his expression a mix of relief and resignation. "Take all the time you need, Miss Connor," he said, "but please don't take too long. Time is a luxury I no longer have." As Rachel left the room, the weight of his words followed her. She walked through the sterile corridors of the hospital, past the impersonal faces of colleagues and patients, feeling the pull of something she couldn't quite name. At the edge of her mind, a question lingered, relentless and insistent. Could she give a dying man the peace he so desperately sought, even if it meant risking her own fragile sense of self? For the first time in years, Rachel felt the delicate stirrings of something beyond her routine, something that terrified her as much as it intrigued her. Rachel stood in front of her modest bathroom mirror, brushing her damp hair into a low ponytail. The smell of coffee lingered faintly from her small kitchen, but she wasn't in the mood for breakfast. The previous night had been restless, her mind cycling through Gregory's strange and heartfelt request. The notion of playing the role of someone else, a role so deeply tied to another's pain, felt both absurd and daunting. Her phone buzzed on the counter, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from Clara. "Morning, Ray, don't let work bury you. Call me later, I miss our chats." Rachel stared at the message longer than necessary. Clara's words, always warm and familiar, felt like a reminder of the fragile connections in her life. With a sigh, she slipped her phone into her bag and headed out the door, the brisk morning air a welcome reprieve from her crowded thoughts. At the hospital, the familiar routine of patient rounds provided some semblance of normalcy. But when Rachel approached Gregory's room, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. She could see him through the small window, propped up in bed and staring out the window with an expression of quiet melancholy. He looked older today, his face etched with the kind of weariness that went beyond physical ailments. She stepped inside. Gregory turned his head, his gaze sharpening when it met hers. "Miss Connor?" he greeted, his voice steady but subdued. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," she replied, pulling his chart from the foot of the bed and scanning it briefly. "How are you feeling today?" He gave a half smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Alive, for now. And though I suspect that's not the answer you're looking for," Rachel lowered the chart, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm here to check on your vitals, not your philosophy." Gregory chuckled softly, though it quickly dissolved into a shallow cough. Rachel moved to adjust his oxygen levels, her movements practiced and precise. "Thank you," he said once he caught his breath. "Though I imagine you didn't come here just to adjust my oxygen." Her fingers paused mid-air, and she slowly straightened. "I thought about what you said yesterday." Gregory's expression shifted, the guarded hope in his eyes impossible to miss. "And I still don't understand why you'd ask this of me," Rachel admitted. "You barely know me. How can you trust a stranger with something so personal?" His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them over the blanket, a subtle reminder of his fragility. "Because I've run out of people to trust, Miss Connor," Money, power, they attract all the wrong kinds of loyalty. But you, he paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. You remind me of Emily. There's something in your eyes. Kindness, maybe. Or perhaps it's just wishful thinking. Rachel shifted her weight, her unease growing. I'm not her. You know that. Gregory nodded, his gaze distant now. Of course. But sometimes, when life has taken everything, even a shadow of what was lost can feel like salvation. The weight of his words hung between them. Rachel felt her resolve wavering, her usual defenses softening against the raw vulnerability in his voice. She had spent years avoiding entanglements, keeping her world small to protect herself from the inevitable pain of loss. And yet, here she was, being pulled into the orbit of a man who seemed to embody that very pain. Tell me about her, Rachel said quietly, surprising herself with the question. Gregory blinked, as if startled by the invitation. He leaned back against the pillows, his voice softening as he began. Emily was everything I wasn't. Fearless, compassionate, always curious about the world. She loved animals, hated injustice. Even as a child, she had this way of making you believe in something bigger than yourself. He paused, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. And I failed her. I was too busy building an empire to see what she needed from me. Then one day, she was gone, vanished without a trace. Rachel's heart clenched at the raw pain in his words. Did you ever find out what happened? Gregory shook his head slowly. There were whispers, theories, a kidnapping, an accident. Evelyn, my wife, Emily's mother, blamed me, said I should have done more. Maybe she was right. Rachel didn't know what to say. She had no memories of her own parents, only fragmented images of foster homes and caseworkers. But the idea of being someone's center, only to lose that anchor, it was a kind of grief she couldn't fully comprehend. I'm sorry, she said finally. It felt inadequate, but it was all she had. Gregory offered a faint smile. Thank you, but it's not your pity I need, Miss Connor. It's your help. She looked away, conflicted. This isn't about me, she said softly, more to herself than to him. Maybe not, Gregory replied, but we all carry ghosts, don't we? The past has a way of finding us, no matter how far we try to run. His words struck a nerve. Rachel thought of her own ghosts, her childhood, the countless nights spent longing for a family that never came. She wondered if Gregory's request was less about him and more about what it stirred in her. Before she could respond, the door opened, and a young man in scrubs entered, his expression professional but warm. Good morning, Mr. Hartwell, and Rachel, he added with a nod. Dr. Tennyson, Rachel acknowledged, her voice cooler than she intended. Doctor. Mark Tennyson was new to the hospital, and his easy confidence grated on her nerves. He had a way of looking at her that felt too probing, too personal. Mark glanced between them, his brows lifting slightly. Everything all right here? Gregory smiled faintly. Miss Connor and I were just discussing life's peculiarities. Rachel stiffened, unwilling to elaborate. We're done for now, she said briskly, stepping back toward the door. Rachel, Gregory called as she reached for the handle. She turned, her expression carefully neutral. Please think about what I asked. You may find that helping me helps you too. Rachel didn't reply, but as she walked away, her chest felt heavier than it had in years. Rachel sat in her small kitchen that evening, the dim light casting long shadows on the chipped countertop. A cup of untouched tea sat before her, the steam curling faintly into the air. Her mind churned with fragments of Gregory's story, his daughter Emily, his regret, his strange, desperate plea. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug, as if its heat might help her sort through the tangle of emotions that had taken root since their conversation. She had spent the day avoiding the decision Gregory had placed before her, but it seemed determined to follow her home, haunting the quiet corners of her mind. Why did he choose her? What did he see in her that reminded him of Emily? And why couldn't she simply dismiss his request as she had planned to? The knock on her door startled her out of her thoughts. Rachel frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, too late for a neighborly visit. Cautiously, she opened the door to find her old friend Clara standing there, a sympathetic smile on her face and a bag of takeout in her hands. "I figured you might need company," Clara said, breezing inside before Rachel could object. "Your texts were weirdly cryptic today. Thought I'd check in before I started overthinking and assumed you were being held hostage or something." Rachel managed a faint smile as Clara placed the takeout on the table and began unpacking boxes of noodles and dumplings. "I'm fine," Rachel said, though her tone lacked conviction. "Liar!" Clara raised an eyebrow as she handed Rachel a set of chopsticks. "Come on, Ray, spill. What's got you looking like someone stole your lunch money?" Rachel hesitated, torn between her instinct to keep things to herself and the comfort of Clara's familiarity. Clara had been her one constant over the years, a friend who understood the weight of their shared history without needing explanations. If anyone could make sense of this, it was her. "There's this patient," Rachel began slowly, her voice tinged with hesitation. "Gregory Hartwell. He's dying. But he's asked me to do something, and it's not exactly normal." Clara's chopsticks paused mid-air, her curiosity piqued. "Define not normal." "He wants me to pretend to be his daughter," Rachel said, the words feeling heavier as she spoke them aloud. "His daughter Emily disappeared years ago, and he wants me to... I don't know, fill the void, I guess." Clara's eyes widened, and she leaned back in her chair, dumpling forgotten. "Wow, that's heavy." Rachel nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "I don't know why he asked me. I mean, I'm just his nurse, and I'm not her. I'll never be her." Clara tilted her head, her expression softening. "Maybe he's not asking you to be her. Maybe he just needs someone to help him find peace, even if it's just an illusion." Rachel's brow furrowed. "But isn't that wrong? To lie to him, even if it's for a good reason?" Clara considered this, her gaze thoughtful. "I don't think it's about lying. It's about giving him a sense of closure. People do all sorts of things for love and comfort, Ray. Sometimes it's messy. Doesn't make it any less real." Rachel leaned back in her chair, Clara's words settling over her like a blanket. She wanted to believe that stepping into this role could be an act of compassion rather than deception, but the stakes felt so high. If she failed, if she made things worse, she didn't know if she could forgive herself. "Do you think I should do it?" Rachel asked quietly. Clara smiled gently. "I think only you can answer that. But for what it's worth, I know you. You don't do anything halfway. If you decide to help him, you'll give it everything you've got. And maybe, just maybe, it'll help you too." The following morning, Rachel returned to the hospital with a sense of resolve she hadn't felt in days. She moved through her routine with careful precision, her mind focused on the task ahead. When she entered Gregory's room, she found him sitting up in bed, his expression neutral but his eyes watchful. "Miss Connor," he greeted, his voice steady. "I wasn't sure you'd come back." Rachel set his chart down and folded her arms across her chest. "I said I'd think about it, didn't I?" Gregory's lips curved into a faint smile. "And? Have you reached a decision?" Rachel hesitated, taking a deep breath before meeting his gaze. "If I agree to this, there need to be boundaries. I'm not your daughter, Mr. Hartwell. I'll do what I can to help, but you need to understand that it's temporary." His smile widened slightly, and he nodded. "I understand, and you can call me Gregory." No need for formalities anymore. Rachel allowed herself a small smile. All right, Gregory, but if this gets too complicated, I reserve the right to walk away. Deal? Deal, he said, his voice firm. As the day wore on, Rachel found herself learning more about Emily through Gregory's stories. He spoke of her childhood, of the way she loved to draw pictures of animals she'd seen in books. He described her laughter, her stubborn streak, her unyielding belief in justice. Each detail painted a vivid picture, and Rachel felt herself drawn into the life of a girl she had never met, but now felt an inexplicable connection to. For the first time, Rachel saw glimpses of the man Gregory must have been before his illness. His voice grew stronger when he spoke of Emily, his eyes lighting up with something akin to hope. She wondered if this was what he had been missing all these years, a chance to share his memories with someone who cared enough to listen. As Rachel left his room that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the cusp of something larger than herself. Gregory's story, his pain, and his hope had stirred something in her, a longing she couldn't quite name. In the quiet of the hospital corridor, Rachel paused and looked out the window at the city lights stretching far into the horizon. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest flicker of possibility, a chance to step out of the shadow of her own past and into something new, something that scared her, but also something that just might set her free. Rachel sat at her desk in the nurse's station, the warm glow of the computer screen casting soft light across her face. She wasn't working, her shift had ended an hour ago, but she lingered, reluctant to return to the solitude of her apartment. She stared at Gregory's file, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk. His request still felt surreal, and despite her decision to help him, a lingering unease coiled tightly in her chest. Burning the midnight oil. The familiar voice of Dr. Mark Tennyson pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced up to find him leaning casually against the counter, a coffee cup in hand, and a curious look on his face. "I could say the same about you," she replied, her tone guarded. Mark had an infuriating knack for appearing at the most inconvenient moments, and she still wasn't sure what to make of him. "Paperwork waits for no one," he said with a shrug. "But something tells me you're not here for the charts." Rachel hesitated, debating how much to reveal. Mark's perceptiveness was both irritating and oddly reassuring, like a mirror she couldn't avoid. Finally, she sighed, "It's Gregory Hartwell. He's complicated." Mark raised an eyebrow. "He's dying. They tend to be." "It's more than that," Rachel said, closing the file and folding her arms across her chest. "He asked me to do something personal." Mark straightened slightly, his curiosity sharpening. "Personal? That doesn't sound like you." "It's not," she admitted, "but he's desperate, and I think he just needs someone to help him find peace." Mark studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "And you're that someone?" "Apparently," Rachel said, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. "Or at least, he seems to think so." Mark set his coffee down, his demeanor softening. "You know, you don't have to take on the weight of the world just because someone asks you to." "It's not that simple," Rachel snapped, surprising even herself with the force of her words. She immediately softened, her shoulders slumping. "Sorry, it's just, I don't know how to explain it. He's not like the others. There's something about him, something that feels familiar." Mark nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. Familiar can be dangerous. It can blur lines, make us see things that aren't really there. Rachel didn't respond. She wasn't sure she agreed with him, but his words stayed with her as she gathered her things and left the hospital. The next day, the tension in Gregory's room was palpable as Rachel walked in, A woman stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the morning light streaming through the curtains. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her hair pulled back in a sleek bun. When she turned, Rachel immediately recognized her from the photos Gregory had shown her. Evelyn Hartwell, the woman introduced herself, her voice smooth and clipped. Her eyes were cold, assessing Rachel with the practiced scrutiny of someone used to being in control. "And you must be the nurse Gregory has been speaking so highly of." Rachel forced a polite smile, extending a hand. "Rachel Connor." "It's nice to meet you." Evelyn shook her hand briefly before turning her attention back to Gregory, who sat in his bed looking more frail than usual. His usual sharp wit was absent, replaced by a resigned weariness that made Rachel's chest tighten. "Gregory," Evelyn said, her tone crisp, "we need to talk about the will." Rachel felt a pang of discomfort at Evelyn's bluntness, but Gregory simply waved a hand weakly. "Not now, Evelyn. Not now." Evelyn's voice rose slightly, a flash of irritation breaking through her otherwise composed demeanor. "Gregory, time isn't exactly on your side. We need to finalize things before I die," Gregory interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "Is that what you're here to remind me of, Evelyn?" Evelyn's jaw tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm here to ensure that everything is handled properly. Someone has to—" Rachel shifted uncomfortably. Unsure whether to stay or leave, she glanced at Gregory, who caught her eye and gave a small nod, silently asking her to remain. She stepped back, folding her hands in front of her as Evelyn turned her icy gaze toward her. "And what exactly is your role in all this?" Evelyn asked, her tone pointed. Rachel met her gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm here to care for your husband." "That's all, is it?" Evelyn's tone was sharp, her eyes narrowing. "Because from what I hear, Gregory has been involving you in personal matters." "Evelyn," Gregory said, his voice tinged with warning. "Leave her out of this." Evelyn ignored him, her focus fixed on Rachel. "You should know, Miss Connor, that my husband has a tendency to blur boundaries. If you've become entangled in his whims, I suggest you reconsider." Rachel's stomach churned, but she kept her expression neutral. "I assure you, Mrs. Hartwell, I know my role here." "Good," Evelyn said, her tone dismissive. She turned back to Gregory, her voice softening slightly. "I'm only trying to help, Gregory. You may not care about your legacy, but I do." Gregory didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the window. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the medical equipment. Finally, Evelyn sighed and gathered her things. She paused by the door, glancing back at Rachel. "Take care of him," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. Then she was gone, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Rachel exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing as the door closed behind Evelyn. She turned to Gregory, who looked more exhausted than ever. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Gregory gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't mind Evelyn. She's always been more concerned with appearances than people." Rachel hesitated, her earlier resolve flickering. "She's not wrong to be concerned, though, about your legacy, I mean." Gregory chuckled weakly. "Legacy is just a fancy word for guilt, Miss Connor. Evelyn and I both have plenty of it to go around." Rachel frowned, unsure how to respond. Gregory's words carried the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime chasing things that now felt hollow. She wondered if his request was less about finding peace and more about rewriting the story he would leave behind. For the rest of the day, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain. Gregory's world, Evelyn's mistrust, and her own doubts swirled together like a storm gathering in the distance. And yet, despite her fear, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. The hospital cafeteria was a cacophony of soft conversations, the clatter of utensils against plates, and the low hum of the coffee machine. Rachel sat at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on her. Evelyn Hartwell's sharp words and cold demeanor still echoed in her mind, but it was Gregory's tired resignation that lingered the most. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a tray being placed on the table. Rachel looked up to see Dr. Mark Tennyson sitting across from her, a sandwich and a bottle of water in front of him. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his tone light but his gaze probing. Rachel gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Just a long day," she replied, not offering more. Mark unwrapped his sandwich and took a bite, his movements unhurried. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "You've been spending a lot of time with Gregory Hartwell." Rachel stiffened slightly, unsure where this was going. "He's my patient," she said carefully. "He's also complicated," Mark said, echoing her own words from their previous conversation. "And from what I've seen, he's taken a particular interest in you." Rachel frowned, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "What are you getting at?" Mark leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. "I'm just saying, be careful. Gregory's a man with a lot of regrets and even more baggage. Getting too close to that, it can get messy." Rachel's gaze sharpened. "You think I don't know that?" Mark held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I think you care more than you let on. And that's not a bad thing, Rachel. Just don't lose yourself in the process." His words struck a nerve, but Rachel didn't let it show. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her mind churning. She hated how easily Mark could read her, how his concern felt both genuine and intrusive. "I can take care of myself," she said finally, her voice steady. Mark nodded, his expression softening into something almost resembling a smile. "I don't doubt it." Rachel stood outside Gregory's room later that afternoon, her hand on the doorknob. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before pushing the door open. Gregory was sitting up in bed, a book resting on his lap. He looked up as she entered, a small smile crossing his face. "Miss Connor," he greeted. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Rachel set her bag on the chair and approached the bed. "I wanted to talk to you about everything," she said, her tone cautious. Gregory closed his book, his expression growing serious. "Go on." Rachel hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've been thinking about what you asked me, about being Emily." Gregory's gaze softened, and he nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I need to understand why," Rachel said, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "Why me? Why now?" "I can't do this if I don't understand," Gregory sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You remind me of her," he said simply, "not just in the way you look, but in the way you carry yourself. There's a kindness in you, a strength that I haven't seen in years." Rachel frowned, her arms crossing over her chest. "But I'm not her, you know that. How can pretending to be her help?" "It's not about replacing her," Gregory said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "It's about closure. I've spent years haunted by what happened, by what I lost. This is my chance to make peace with it." Rachel's chest tightened at the raw vulnerability in his words. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the weight of years of regret pressing down on him. "And what about me?" she asked softly. "What does this do to me?" Gregory's expression faltered, and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the window. "I can't promise this won't be difficult," he admitted, "but I can promise that it will mean something, to me and maybe even to you." Rachel's heart ached at the sincerity in his voice. She thought of her own past, of the years she had spent longing for connection, for a sense of belonging. Gregory's request scared her, but it also stirred something deep within her, a flicker of hope that she hadn't felt in years. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "but only if we're honest with each other. No pretending beyond what's necessary." Gregory's eyes brightened, and he nodded, his relief palpable. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me." Rachel forced a small smile, though her chest felt heavy with the weight of what she had just agreed to. "Let's take it one step at a time," she said. "We'll figure this out together." That evening, Rachel sat in her apartment, staring at an old photo she had kept tucked away in a drawer for years. It was a faded Polaroid of herself as a child, holding a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. She had found it in a box of things left behind at one of her foster homes and had kept it ever since, though she didn't know why. She thought of Gregory's stories about Emily, of the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of her. Rachel wondered if her own parents had ever spoken of her like that, if they had ever missed her the way Gregory missed Emily. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Clara. "Whatever you decide, Ray, you're stronger than you think. Don't let fear make your choices for you." Rachel smiled faintly, her friend's words resonating in a way she hadn't expected. She placed the photo back in the drawer and stood, a sense of quiet determination settling over her. Tomorrow, she would begin the next step in Gregory's strange and difficult request. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time, she felt ready to face the uncertainty. Rachel arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had made. The corridors were quieter in the morning, the hum of machinery and the occasional murmur of conversation echoing softly against the sterile walls. She paused outside Gregory's room, her fingers brushing the small, worn Polaroid of her childhood that she had slipped into her pocket for reasons she couldn't quite explain. When she entered, Gregory was awake, his face pale but alert, as he gazed out the window. A sliver of sunlight bathed his bed in a golden glow, softening the hard lines of his weary expression. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his eyes brightening. "Miss Connor," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." Rachel gave him a faint smile, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "I said I would help you, Gregory. I'm here." His expression softened, a mixture of gratitude and relief crossing his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Rachel hesitated, the enormity of what they were about to do settling heavily over her. "Before we start, I need to know more," she said, her voice steady but firm. "About Emily, about the life she had before she disappeared." Gregory nodded, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for a worn leather photo album on the bedside table. "These are all I have left," he said, opening the album carefully. The pages were filled with pictures of a young girl with bright eyes and a wide, mischievous smile. "That's Emily at 7, Gregory said, pointing to a photo of her holding a small cat in her arms. "She found that stray in the alley behind our house. I told her we couldn't keep it, but she cried until I gave in. She named him Charlie." Rachel traced the edge of the photo with her finger, her chest tightening. "She looks happy." "She was," Gregory said, his voice tinged with both pride and regret. "She was the light in our lives. But Evelyn and I, we were too busy, too consumed by our own ambitions to see what she needed from us." Rachel looked up at him, her brow furrowing. "What happened the day she disappeared?" Gregory's face darkened, his eyes clouding with painful memories. "She went to the park with her nanny, Lillian. It was a quiet afternoon, nothing unusual. But when Lillian turned her back for just a moment, Emily was gone, vanished without a trace." Rachel's stomach churned at the thought, the unimaginable pain of losing a child pressing against her. "And no one saw anything?" No clues, no leads. Gregory shook his head slowly. There were whispers, theories. Some said she was taken, others that she ran away, but nothing ever came of it. The police searched for months. Evelyn hired private investigators, but eventually the trail went cold. Rachel's voice softened. You've carried this with you all these years. Gregory's gaze met hers, raw and unguarded. There's no closure when you lose someone like that. Only questions and regrets. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. Rachel felt the familiar ache of her own losses rising to the surface, the years of unanswered questions about her parents and the life she might have had if things had been different. I don't know if I can give you the answers you're looking for, Rachel said finally, her voice low. But I'll do my best to help you find peace. Gregory nodded, his expression resolute. That's all I can ask. Later that afternoon, Rachel found herself standing in front of the hospital's small garden, its neatly trimmed hedges and colourful blooms offering a rare moment of tranquility. She was about to head back inside when she heard footsteps behind her. Taking a break. Mark's voice was warm, but Rachel could sense the undercurrent of curiosity in his tone. She turned to find him holding a clipboard, his white coat billowing slightly in the breeze. Something like that, she said, crossing her arms. Mark studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. You've been spending a lot of time with Gregory lately. Rachel's defenses rose instinctively. He's my patient. He's also complicated, Mark said, echoing his earlier words. And from what I hear, he's asked you for something unusual. Rachel stiffened, her gaze narrowing. What exactly have you heard? Mark hesitated, choosing his words carefully. People talk, Rachel. They're saying Gregory's been unusually focused on you, that he sees something in you that reminds him of his daughter. Rachel's stomach tightened, a mix of anger and vulnerability swirling within her. I don't owe anyone an explanation, she said, her voice clipped. I'm not asking for one, Mark said gently. I'm just concerned about you. Rachel's breath hitched, the unexpected sincerity in his voice catching her off guard. She looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of her jacket. I can handle myself, she said, though the words felt hollow. Mark stepped closer, his tone softening. I know you can. But just because you can handle something doesn't mean you have to do it alone. Rachel met his gaze, her walls cracking slightly under the weight of his concern. She wanted to push him away, to keep the world at arm's length as she always had. But something about the way he looked at her, steadfast and genuine, made her pause. Thank you, she said finally, her voice quiet. But I need to do this. Mark nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself too. Rachel nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and unease. As Mark walked away, she turned back to the garden, the sun casting long shadows across the vibrant flowers. She felt the familiar pull of doubt and fear gnawing at the edges of her resolve, but beneath it all, a small, steady voice urged her forward. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. For Gregory, for herself, and for the hope that somewhere in this tangled mess, they might both find a measure of peace. The morning was heavy with the threat of rain, the dark clouds pressing low against the city skyline as Rachel walked briskly toward Gregory's hospital room. She clutched her coat tightly around her, her mind racing with thoughts of how the day would unfold. She had agreed to step into the role Gregory so desperately needed, but doubts lingered, whispering questions she couldn't quite silence. As she entered the room, she was met with Gregory's smile, soft and hopeful, like a man who had found a small reprieve from his grief. He sat upright in bed, his color slightly improved, though the frailty of his frame was a stark reminder of the little time they had left. "Miss Connor," he greeted warmly, "or should I say, Emily?" Rachel hesitated, the weight of her agreement settling heavily on her shoulders. "Let's not jump ahead, Gregory," she replied, pulling a chair closer to his bedside. "We'll take this one step at a time." Gregory chuckled softly, though it quickly turned into a shallow cough. Rachel instinctively reached for a glass of water, holding it steady as he sipped. Once the coughing subsided, he leaned back, his expression grateful. "Thank you," he said, his voice rasping slightly. "You've already given me more than I deserve." Rachel didn't respond immediately, her gaze drifting to the photo album on the bedside table. She opened it carefully, flipping through the pages until she found a picture of Emily at what looked to be a birthday party. Her face was alight with joy, her hands clutching a balloon animal as she laughed at something out of frame. "What was she like?" Rachel asked softly, her fingers brushing the edge of the photo. Gregory's eyes grew distant, his voice taking on a wistful tone. "She was fearless, always pushing boundaries, asking questions no one else dared to ask. She had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world, even if she was just a little girl." Rachel smiled faintly, the image of Emily in her mind growing clearer with each story Gregory shared. But beneath the warmth of his memories, she felt the sharp edges of her own doubts. Could she truly step into this role? Could she offer Gregory the closure he sought without losing herself in the process? As the day progressed, Rachel found herself slipping deeper into the persona Gregory needed. It began with small things, responding to Emily's name when he called, asking questions about the places he remembered from her childhood. Gregory's face would light up with each interaction, his voice growing stronger as he recounted tales of Emily's adventures. But as the hours wore on, the lines between reality and pretense began to blur. Gregory spoke to her not as a stand-in, but as if she truly were his daughter, returned after all these years. Rachel felt the weight of his trust pressing against her, the enormity of what she had taken on becoming increasingly clear. Late in the afternoon, Evelyn swept into the room, her presence as sharp and cold as the wind outside. She was dressed impeccably as always, her eyes narrowing as they fell on Rachel seated by Gregory's side. "What's this?" Evelyn demanded, her tone clipped. "Playing house now, are we?" Rachel stood, her posture stiffening under Evelyn's scrutinizing gaze. "I'm just here to support Gregory," she said evenly. Evelyn's lips thinned into a harsh line as she turned to her husband. "And you're encouraging this charade? What do you think this will accomplish, Gregory?" Gregory's expression darkened, his usual patience with Evelyn giving way to quiet defiance. "It's not a charade," he said firmly. "It's something I need, something you could never understand." Evelyn's eyes flashed with anger. "What I understand is that you're indulging in a fantasy, one that will only hurt you and everyone else when reality comes crashing back." Rachel felt the sting of Evelyn's words, but Gregory remained resolute. "Reality is already cruel enough, Evelyn. If this gives me peace in my final days, then so be it." Evelyn's gaze flicked back to Rachel, her expression calculating. "And you? Are you so eager to play this part? Do you even know what you're getting into?" Rachel met Evelyn's glare with a steady gaze, though her heart raced in her chest. "I know exactly what I'm doing. Gregory asked for my help, and I agreed. This isn't about me or you. It's about him." Evelyn scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're helping him? You're feeding a lie, one that will only deepen his regrets when it all falls apart." "Enough!" Gregory said sharply, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the room. "I won't have you undermining this. Not here. Not now." Evelyn looked as though she might argue, but something in Gregory's tone stopped her. She huffed softly, her gaze hardening as she turned on her heel and strode toward the door. "Do what you will," she said coldly. "But don't say, 'I didn't warn you.'" The door closed behind her with a sharp click, leaving Rachel and Gregory in a tense silence. Rachel sank back into her chair, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry about that," Gregory said after a moment, his voice weary. "Evelyn has always had a way of making things difficult." Rachel shook her head, her voice quiet. "She's not wrong, though. What we're doing, it's complicated." Gregory reached out, his frail hand resting lightly on hers. "Life is complicated, Miss Connor. But sometimes, the only way to make sense of it is to hold on to the things that matter, no matter how fleeting." Rachel met his gaze, her chest tightening with the weight of his words. She had spent so much of her life running from complications, from connections that might anchor her to something she couldn't control. But here, in this room, with this man who had lost so much, she found herself willing to take the risk, for Gregory, for herself, for the fragile bond they were building, one moment at a time. Rachel sat in her apartment that night, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the otherwise silent room. She hadn't turned on the television, hadn't even bothered with her usual cup of tea. Instead, she stared at the Polaroid photo of herself as a child, the faded image, a haunting reminder of her own fractured past. Gregory's stories about Emily echoed in her mind, interwoven with Evelyn's cutting words, "You're feeding a lie." Rachel sighed and placed the photo back on the counter. She couldn't deny the weight of Evelyn's accusation, but she also couldn't shake the certainty in Gregory's eyes when he had thanked her. Maybe, and for once, the truth wasn't as black and white as she wanted it to be. The next morning, Rachel arrived at the hospital with a renewed determination. Gregory's fragile hope had taken root in her, and while she knew the risks, she couldn't bring herself to turn away. The role she had agreed to play wasn't just for him anymore. It was for the part of herself that still yearned to be needed. When she entered his room, she found him poring over a leather-bound journal, his thin fingers carefully turning the pages. He looked up as she approached, a smile breaking across his face. "Emily," he said softly, his voice filled with a warmth that made Rachel's chest tighten. She hesitated for the briefest moment before stepping closer. "Good morning, Dad," she said, the word tasting unfamiliar, yet not unwelcome. Gregory's smile widened, and he gestured for her to sit. "I was just looking through some old memories," he said, tapping the journal. "Things I thought I'd forgotten." Rachel took the chair beside him, her gaze drifting to the journal. "What kind of memories?" He opened the book to a page filled with faded writing and a crude drawing of a house surrounded by stick figures. "Emily drew this when she was 6, he said, his voice tinged with both pride and sadness. "She said it was our family, her, me, Evelyn, and even the nanny." Rachel traced the edges of the drawing with her eyes. "It's beautiful." "She had a gift for seeing beauty in everything," Gregory said, his voice growing wistful. "Even in the cracks of our family." Rachel hesitated, unsure if she should ask the question that had been pressing on her since Evelyn's outburst. "What happened between you and Evelyn?" After Emily disappeared, Gregory's face darkened, his hand hovering over the journal. "We broke," he said simply. "Evelyn blamed me. I blamed her. The truth is, we were both too consumed by our own pain to see each other, let alone heal together." He looked at Rachel, his gaze steady but heavy with regret. "Evelyn built walls to protect herself. I buried myself in my work. And in the end, we both lost more than just Emily." Rachel nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. She thought of Evelyn's cold demeanor, the sharp edges of her personality. Maybe those walls Gregory spoke of were all Evelyn had left to shield herself from the unbearable weight of her own grief. Before Rachel could respond, the door opened, and Dr. Mark Tennyson entered, clipboard in hand. His expression brightened slightly when he saw Rachel, though his gaze quickly flickered to Gregory. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," Mark said, his tone professional but warm. "How are we feeling today?" "Better," Gregory replied, his smile faint but genuine. "Having Emily here helps." Mark's eyebrows lifted slightly, and Rachel braced herself for a comment, but to her surprise, he simply nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "I'm glad to hear it," he said, his tone carefully neutral. As he checked Gregory's vitals, Rachel watched him closely, noting the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly when Gregory referred to her as Emily. When Mark finished his assessment, he turned to Rachel, his gaze lingering. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Rachel glanced at Gregory, who gave her a reassuring nod. She followed Mark into the hallway, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. "What are you doing, Rachel?" Mark asked as soon as the door closed behind them. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "This isn't you." Rachel folded her arms, meeting his gaze head-on. "You don't know what this is," she said evenly. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me," Mark said, his frustration evident. "Because from where I'm standing, you're crossing lines you shouldn't be crossing." Rachel took a deep breath, her emotions threatening to spill over. "Gregory needs this," she said, her voice quieter now. "He's dying, Mark. And if pretending to be his daughter gives him even a little peace, then who am I to deny him that?" Mark shook his head, his expression a mixture of disbelief and concern. "And what about you? What happens to you when this is all over? You think you can just walk away from this without it affecting you?" Rachel hesitated, the question cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. "I don't know," she said finally. "But I can't stand by and do nothing while he's in so much pain." Mark's gaze softened, and he took a step closer. "Rachel, you have one of the biggest hearts of anyone I've ever met, but you can't save everyone. Sometimes, trying to save someone else means losing yourself." She looked away, his words striking a chord she wasn't ready to confront. "I appreciate your concern, Mark," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But this is my choice." Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Just promise me you'll be careful," he said, his tone gentler now. "I don't want to see you get hurt." Rachel nodded, though she couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. "I'll be fine," she said, more for herself than for him. As she returned to Gregory's room, Rachel couldn't shake Mark's words. They lingered in the back of her mind like a shadow, a reminder of the precarious line she was walking. But when she saw the smile on Gregory's face, the warmth in his eyes as he greeted her, she pushed those doubts aside. For now, she would focus on the moments they had. One step at a time, one memory at a time, she would help Gregory find the peace he so desperately sought, even if it meant losing a part of herself along the way. Rachel sat with Gregory in his hospital room, the early afternoon light filtering through the blinds in fractured lines. He looked better today, more animated as he gestured toward the open photo album between them. His voice was steadier too, though it occasionally faltered under the weight of emotion. "This was her favorite park," Gregory said, pointing to a photo of Emily sitting on a swing. "We used to go there every Saturday. I'd push her for what felt like hours. She'd laugh and beg me not to stop." Rachel smiled faintly, tracing the edges of the photo with her fingers. She could almost hear the laughter Gregory described, almost feel the bond that once existed between him and his daughter. "She looks so happy," Rachel said softly. "She was," Gregory replied, his tone tinged with wistfulness, "before the world decided to take her away." The room fell quiet, the weight of his grief settling between them like a heavy fog. Rachel hesitated before speaking, her voice careful. Do you ever think there's still a chance she's out there somewhere? Gregory's gaze shifted to the window, his expression distant. I used to think that, he admitted. For years, I held on to the hope that she'd come back, that I'd wake up one day and she'd be standing in the doorway, smiling like nothing had happened. But as the years went by, his voice faltered, and he closed his eyes briefly. Hope started to feel like a cruel joke. Rachel's chest tightened, her own memories stirring painfully. She thought of the endless nights she'd spent as a child, staring at the ceiling of yet another foster home, wondering if her parents were out there somewhere, thinking of her. That ache of longing, of never knowing, was something she and Gregory shared, though neither of them said it aloud. I think hope is what keeps us going, even when it feels impossible, Rachel said finally, her voice quiet but firm. Even if it hurts. Gregory looked at her, his gaze softening. You're a remarkable woman, Rachel, he said, using her real name for the first time in days. I don't know what I'd do without you. Before Rachel could respond, the door opened abruptly, and Evelyn strode in, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She stopped short at the sight of Rachel sitting so close to Gregory, her eyes narrowing. Am I interrupting? Evelyn asked, her tone cutting. Rachel straightened, forcing a neutral expression. Not at all. We were just talking. Evelyn's gaze shifted to Gregory, her lips pressing into a thin line. We need to discuss the estate, she said. The lawyers are pressuring me for answers. Gregory sighed heavily, his momentary warmth dissipating. Evelyn, must we do this now? Yes, we must, Evelyn snapped, her frustration barely concealed. You've been avoiding this for weeks, Gregory. It's time to make decisions. Rachel rose from her chair, sensing that this was a conversation she didn't need to be part of. I'll give you two some privacy, she said, moving toward the door. Stay, Gregory said firmly, his eyes meeting hers. You've been part of this from the beginning, Rachel. I want you here. Evelyn bristled, her glare shifting between them. Part of this? What exactly is she part of, Gregory? Gregory's expression hardened, a rare defiance in his usually gentle demeanor. Rachel is helping me. She's the only one who's been willing to listen, to give me what I need. And what exactly is that? Evelyn demanded, her voice rising. Another fantasy, another lie to make yourself feel better. Enough, Evelyn, Gregory said sharply. This isn't about you or your need for control. This is about me and what little time I have left. Rachel felt the tension in the room tighten like a coiled spring, the cracks in their fractured relationship laid bare. She hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or let them work through their argument. Evelyn's voice softened, but her tone remained bitter. I've spent my entire life trying to hold this family together, Gregory. While you buried yourself in your work and your guilt, I was the one left to pick up the pieces. Gregory's gaze dropped, a flicker of shame crossing his face. I know I failed you, Evelyn. I failed both of you. But that doesn't mean I don't deserve this, one chance to make peace with my mistakes. Rachel's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his words. Evelyn's expression faltered for a moment, a crack in her icy exterior that revealed a glimpse of the pain she carried. This isn't just about you, Gregory, Evelyn said finally, her voice trembling slightly. You're not the only one who lost her. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of shared grief settling over them. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, feeling like an intruder in a moment that was far too personal. I'll step out, Rachel said softly, moving toward the door. Gregory didn't stop her this time. As she left, she caught one last look at him, his face etched with exhaustion and regret. Evelyn stood by the window, her back to him, her posture rigid. Rachel wandered the hospital corridors, her mind churning with the argument she had just witnessed. It was clear that Gregory and Evelyn's wounds ran deeper than she had realized, their grief intertwined with years of resentment and unspoken truths. She found herself in the small hospital garden, the crisp autumn air, a welcome relief from the stifling tension of the room. She sat on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Rachel," a voice said, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Mark standing a few feet away, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "You okay?" he asked, taking a seat beside her. Rachel nodded, though her shoulders sagged. "It's just a lot," she admitted. "Gregory, Evelyn, there's so much pain there, and I don't know if I'm helping or just making it worse." Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're doing what you think is right," he said. "That's more than most people would do." Rachel sighed, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Sometimes I wonder if Evelyn's right, if I'm just feeding Gregory's fantasies, giving him false hope." Mark looked at her, his gaze steady. "Hope isn't false just because it hurts. Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps us going." Rachel met his gaze, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his voice. "I just want to do the right thing," she said softly. "You are," Mark said simply, "even if it doesn't feel like it." Rachel didn't respond, but as they sat together in the quiet garden, she felt a small measure of comfort. The road ahead was uncertain, the cracks beneath the surface growing deeper with every step, but for now, she would keep moving forward, one fragile bond at a time. Rachel returned to Gregory's room the next morning, bracing herself for whatever aftermath had unfolded between him and Evelyn after she left. The air felt heavy as she pushed open the door. Gregory sat upright in bed, but his usually vibrant blue eyes looked clouded, distant. The journal he so often clung to was closed on his lap, his hands resting over it as though guarding something precious. "Good morning," Rachel said cautiously, setting her bag down on the chair. She studied his face, searching for a trace of the man who had found solace in sharing Emily's memories. Gregory looked up, his expression softening slightly. "Rachel," he said, his voice weaker than usual. "I was starting to think you might not come back." She smiled faintly, pulling her chair closer to his bedside. "I'm here. I told you I wouldn't leave." His lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've already stayed longer than most." Rachel ignored the pang his words caused, choosing instead to focus on what had been left unsaid. "How did things go with Evelyn?" she asked, her tone careful. Gregory sighed heavily, his gaze drifting toward the window. "She's angry, always angry, but beneath it, there's sadness too, so much sadness." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "I think she's afraid." "Afraid of what?" Rachel pressed gently. "Of losing control," Gregory said, "of losing what little we have left. Evelyn's always been like that, clinging to the idea of order, as if it could somehow shield her from the chaos of life." Rachel thought of Evelyn's sharp words, her icy exterior that cracked only momentarily under the weight of her grief. "Do you think she blames herself for Emily?" Gregory's expression grew pained. "She does, but she'd never admit it. And maybe I blame her too, in ways I shouldn't. We both made mistakes, Rachel. We both failed Emily when she needed us most." Rachel reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his. "You're doing what you can now," she said softly. "That matters." Gregory looked at her, his eyes glistening. "It does, doesn't it?" Before Rachel could respond, the door opened and Evelyn entered, her presence as commanding as ever. She carried a leather bag, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her gaze fell on Rachel, narrowing slightly before turning to Gregory. "I need a word with my husband," Evelyn said curtly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Rachel hesitated, looking to Gregory for guidance. He nodded faintly, a silent reassurance that it was okay to leave. She stood, gathering her things. "I'll be back later," Rachel said quietly, giving Gregory's hand a light squeeze before slipping past Evelyn and into the hallway. Rachel wandered through the hospital corridors, her mind heavy with thoughts of Gregory and Evelyn. She found herself drawn to the staff lounge, where the scent of coffee and the low hum of conversation offered a brief respite. To her surprise, Mark was there, leaning against the counter with a mug in hand. His gaze lifted when he saw her, his expression softening. "Rachel," he said, setting his mug down, "you look tired." She managed a faint smile. "Thanks for the compliment," Mark chuckled, motioning for her to sit. "Rough morning." Rachel sank into a chair, exhaling deeply. Evelyn's back. Every time she and Gregory talk, it feels like something shatters between them. "She's been through a lot too," Mark said thoughtfully, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "Grief doesn't always look the same on everyone." Rachel tilted her head, studying him. "You're surprisingly sympathetic toward her," Mark shrugged. "I've seen my share of people who build walls to survive. Doesn't make it right, but it's human." Rachel nodded, his words resonating. "I just wish I could help them both, but sometimes it feels like I'm in the middle of a battle I don't understand." Mark leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You're doing more than you realize. Just being there, listening, it matters." Rachel felt a flicker of gratitude for his unwavering support, though doubts still lingered. "I'm not sure if it's enough." "It's more than most people would do," Mark said. "Don't underestimate that." When Rachel returned to Gregory's room later that afternoon, Evelyn was gone. Gregory looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped as though the conversation had drained what little energy he had left. Rachel approached cautiously, her movements quiet. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Gregory looked up at her, his expression weary. "I will be," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Rachel hesitated before sitting down. "Do you want to talk about it?" Gregory shook his head slowly. "Evelyn and we've been living with ghosts for so long, Rachel. Sometimes I think we don't know how to be with the living anymore." Rachel's chest tightened at the sadness in his voice. She reached for the journal on his lap, her fingers brushing against the worn leather. "May I?" she asked softly. He nodded, and she opened the journal, her gaze scanning the faded handwriting and drawings. One entry caught her eye, a letter written in Gregory's precise script. "Dear Emily," it began. "If you ever find this, know that I loved you more than words can say. I wasn't the father you deserved, but you were always the daughter I dreamed of. I hope, wherever you are, you've found happiness." Rachel's throat tightened as she read the words, her heart aching for the man who had carried this pain for so long. She closed the journal carefully, her voice steady as she spoke. "She would have forgiven you, Gregory." "I know she would." Gregory's eyes glistened, and he reached for her hand, his grip weak but firm. "You've given me more than forgiveness, Rachel. You've given me hope." Tears pricked at Rachel's eyes, but she blinked them away, determined to remain strong. "Then let's hold on to that hope, together." For the first time in years, Rachel felt a sense of purpose she couldn't ignore. Gregory's faith in her, his willingness to trust her with his pain, gave her the strength to keep moving forward. No matter the fractures in their shared truths, she would see this through to the end, for him, for Emily, and for herself. The next morning, Rachel walked into Gregory's room and immediately sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Gregory seemed unusually subdued, his hands resting idly on the closed photo album in his lap. His usual small, hopeful smile was absent, replaced by a pensive frown that deepened the lines on his face. "Good morning," Rachel said softly, setting her bag on the chair. Gregory looked up, offering a faint nod. "Morning, Rachel." She sat beside him, studying his face. "You seem distracted today. Is everything all right?" He hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly against the leather cover of the album. "Evelyn and I talked yesterday," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of reluctance. "It wasn't easy." Rachel leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "Do you want to tell me about it?" Gregory sighed, his gaze drifting to the window. "She brought up things I haven't allowed myself to think about for years. Decisions we made, mistakes we can't undo." Rachel waited, sensing he needed space to gather his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with emotion. "Evelyn accused me of living in the past," he said. "She's not wrong. I've spent so long clinging to the memories of Emily that I haven't truly lived since she disappeared." Rachel's chest tightened. She thought of the many ways she had avoided confronting her own past, the scars she carried from her childhood. "Sometimes the past feels safer than the present," she said quietly. "It's familiar, even when it hurts." Gregory nodded, his expression softening. "You understand that better than most, don't you?" Rachel didn't answer immediately, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I've spent a lot of my life wondering what I lost, what might have been if things were different. But at some point, I realized I couldn't keep living in the what-ifs. It's exhausting." Gregory reached for her hand, his touch light but steady. "You're stronger than I am, Rachel. I'm not sure I could face what you've faced and still find a way forward." She smiled faintly, though her heart ached for him. "It's not strength, Gregory. It's survival. And I think you've done more of that than you give yourself credit for." The room fell into a contemplative silence, broken only by the faint hum of the machines around them. Rachel glanced at the photo album in his lap, her curiosity piqued. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to it. Gregory nodded, and she opened the album, flipping through the familiar images of Emily. Her fingers paused on a photo she hadn't noticed before. Emily standing with a woman who wasn't Evelyn. The woman's face was kind, her arm wrapped protectively around Emily's shoulders. "Who's this?" Rachel asked, tilting the photo toward Gregory. Gregory's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition sparking in his eyes. "That's Lillian," he said. "Emily's nanny." Rachel traced the edges of the photo thoughtfully. "You've mentioned her before. She was with Emily the day she disappeared, right?" Gregory's face darkened. "Yes, Evelyn blamed her, of course, but I never did. Lillian loved Emily. She treated her like her own child." "Do you know what happened to her after Emily disappeared?" Rachel asked. Gregory hesitated, his gaze distant. "She left. Evelyn made sure of that. She said Lillian's presence was a reminder of our failure. I didn't fight her on it, and I've regretted it ever since." Rachel's mind raced. There was something in Gregory's tone, in the way he spoke about Lillian, that felt important. "Do you think she might still be out there? Maybe she knows something about what happened." Gregory looked at her, his expression both hopeful and uncertain. "I don't know, Rachel. But if she is, she's the only one who might." Rachel nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then I think we should find her." Rachel spent her lunch break in the hospital library, poring over old directories and online archives. It was a tedious process, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Lillian held a key to understanding what had happened to Emily, and perhaps even to helping Gregory find peace. When Mark found her, she was hunched over a stack of papers, her focus so intense that she didn't notice his approach. "You're working awfully hard for someone who's not on call," he said, his voice laced with curiosity. Rachel looked up, startled, "Mark, I didn't hear you." He gestured to the papers. "What's all this?" Rachel hesitated, debating how much to share. But Mark had been a constant presence in her life lately, and his concern felt genuine. "I'm looking for someone," she admitted. "Lillian, she was Emily's nanny." Mark frowned, leaning against the edge of the table. "Why now?" "I think she might know something about what happened," Rachel said. "Gregory talks about her like she was part of the family. If anyone remembers Emily the way he does, it's her." Mark studied her, his expression thoughtful. "You're getting deeper into this than I think you realize." "I know," Rachel said firmly. "But if there's even a chance she can help, I have to try." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Just promise me you'll be careful, Rachel. People like Evelyn won't appreciate you digging into the past." Rachel nodded, though her determination didn't waver. "I'll be careful," she said, "but I'm not stopping." That evening, Rachel returned to Gregory's room, her mind buzzing with possibilities. She found him dozing lightly, his breathing even and steady. She didn't wake him, instead sitting quietly by his bedside and watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt a glimmer of purpose, a sense that she was moving towards something meaningful. Gregory had given her more than a reason to stay. He had reminded her of the power of hope, even in the face of despair. As the night deepened, Rachel made a silent promise to herself. She would find Lillian, no matter what it took. Because in helping Gregory heal, she was beginning to mend her own fractured heart. The following morning, Rachel woke earlier than usual, her mind already buzzing with the day's purpose. The search for Lillian had taken root in her thoughts overnight, and now it was a mission she couldn't ignore. After a quick breakfast, she grabbed her coat and headed to the hospital, armed with the names and addresses she had pieced together from the previous day's research. By the time she arrived at Gregory's room, he was awake, his eyes brighter than she had seen in days. The usual heaviness in the room seemed lighter somehow, as if the prospect of finding Lillian had sparked a quiet hope within him. "Good morning," Rachel said, setting her bag down on the chair. "How are you feeling today?" Gregory offered a faint smile. "Better, I think. Did you find anything?" Rachel pulled out a small notebook from her bag, flipping it open to the notes she had scrawled the night before. "I have a few leads," she said, her tone cautious. "It's not much, but it's a start. There's one name that might be her, a Lillian Davenport, living in a retirement community about an hour from here." Gregory's eyes lit up, and he leaned forward slightly, his frail hands gripping the edge of the blanket. "Do you think it's her?" Rachel hesitated, not wanting to get his hopes up prematurely. "I don't know, but it's worth checking out." Gregory nodded, his expression resolute. "Thank you, Rachel, for doing this." Rachel smiled softly, her chest tightening with emotion. "You don't have to thank me. This is as much for you as it is for Emily." Rachel left the hospital a little after noon, the address she had found for Lillian Davenport scribbled neatly on a scrap of paper in her pocket. The drive to the retirement community was uneventful, the city streets giving way to quieter, tree-lined roads as she neared her destination. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the neatly manicured lawns of the facility. Inside, the building was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and the faint scent of lavender in the air. A receptionist greeted Rachel with a kind smile, her hands poised over a computer keyboard. "Good afternoon," the woman said. "How can I help you?" "I'm looking for someone who lives here," Rachel said, glancing at the paper in her hand. "Lillian Davenport. Is she available?" The receptionist's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced at her screen. "Lillian? Yes, she's here. Let me see if she's up for visitors." She picked up the phone and spoke quietly for a moment before nodding. "She's in the common room, down the hall, third door on your right." Rachel thanked her and made her way down the hallway, her nerves tightening with every step. What if this wasn't the right Lillian? What if she didn't remember Emily, or worse, didn't want to talk about her? Rachel pushed the doubts aside as she reached the door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The common room was cozy, with plush chairs and a large window overlooking a garden. An older woman sat near the window, her grey hair neatly pinned back and a blanket draped over her lap. She was reading a book, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "Lillian Davenport?" Rachel asked softly, stepping closer. The woman looked up, her sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, who's asking?" "My name is Rachel Connor," Rachel said, her voice steady. "I work at a hospital in the city. I was hoping to ask you about someone you used to know, Emily Hartwell." At the mention of Emily's name, Lillian's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing over her face. She closed her book slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she set it aside. "Emily," Lillian repeated, her voice quiet but tinged with emotion. "It's been years since I've heard that name." Rachel pulled a chair closer, her heart pounding. "Gregory Hartwell is one of my patients. He talks about Emily all the time, about how much he misses her. He told me you were her nanny." Lillian nodded, her gaze distant. "I was, from the time she was a baby until she disappeared." She paused, her voice catching. "It broke my heart. She was like a daughter to me." Rachel leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. "Do you remember anything from that day? Anything that might help us understand what happened?" Lillian hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. "I've replayed that day in my mind 1,000 times, she said. "I took her to the park, like I always did. She was playing on the swings, laughing like she always did. I turned away for just a moment, just long enough to grab her water bottle from the bench. When I looked back, she was gone." Rachel's heart ached at the pain in Lillian's voice. "Did you see anyone? Anything unusual?" Lillian shook her head, her expression anguished. "No, it was like she vanished into thin air. I blamed myself for years. But there was something else. Something Evelyn said later that always stayed with me." "What did she say?" Rachel pressed. Lillian hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "She said it was better this way, that Emily was safe now. I didn't understand it then, and she never explained, but I always wondered, did she know something I didn't?" Rachel's stomach churned. Evelyn's cold demeanor, her resistance to Gregory's efforts to revisit the past, it all suddenly felt more deliberate, more sinister. "You think Evelyn might have had something to do with it?" "I don't know," Lillian admitted. "But she was always controlling. And after Emily disappeared, she became even colder, more distant. It was like she shut down completely." Rachel's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to take shape. If Evelyn had known more than she let on, it could change everything. "Thank you, Lillian," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "You've been a big help." Lillian smiled faintly, her expression softening. "If you find her, tell her I never stopped loving her." Rachel nodded, her throat tight. "I will." As she left the retirement community, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she was closer to the truth than ever before. But with that truth came a new layer of uncertainty and the growing suspicion that Evelyn Hartwell held the answers they had been searching for all along. Rachel sat in her car in the parking lot of the retirement community, the engine idling as her thoughts raced. Lillian's words had shaken her, especially the implication that Evelyn might have known something about Emily's disappearance. She stared at the crumpled note in her hand where she had hastily written down Lillian's observations. She said it was better this way, that Emily was safe now. The words lingered in her mind, heavy and unrelenting. She pulled her phone from her bag, her fingers hovering over the screen. Clara's name flashed up as the first contact. For a moment, Rachel debated calling her friend, seeking the clarity she always seemed to bring. But Rachel pushed the phone aside, knowing this was something she needed to unravel herself. By the time Rachel returned to the hospital, the sky had darkened, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She took a deep breath and stepped out of her car, clutching her bag tightly. The hospital lobby was quiet, the muted hum of the evening shift settling over the space. Rachel made her way to Gregory's room, her mind still racing with everything she had learned. Gregory was awake when she entered, his eyes lifting to meet hers with quiet expectation. His face softened when he saw her, though a flicker of concern crossed his features. "You're back," he said, his voice weak but steady. "Did you find her?" Rachel nodded, pulling the chair closer to his bed and sitting down. "I did. Gregory, Lillian remembers everything about Emily, about that day, and she said something that I think you need to hear." Gregory's expression tensed, his frail hands gripping the edge of the blanket. "What did she say?" Rachel hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She told me that Evelyn once said Emily was safe now, that it was better this way. Lillian didn't understand what she meant, but it made her wonder if Evelyn knew more than she let on." Gregory's face darkened, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed her words. "Evelyn," he repeated, his voice edged with disbelief. She couldn't have done something to Emily." "I don't think she hurt her," Rachel said quickly. "But Gregory, think about it. Evelyn has always resisted talking about Emily, hasn't she? She's shut down every attempt you've made to find answers." Gregory's gaze dropped, his hands trembling slightly. "She has," he admitted, "but I always thought it was her way of coping. I never imagined." His voice faltered, and he looked back at Rachel, his expression haunted. "Do you think Evelyn knows where Emily is?" "I don't know," Rachel said honestly. "But I think she knows more than she's told you." Gregory sank back against the pillows, his face pale, the silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken possibilities. Rachel reached out, placing a hand over his. "We need to talk to her," she said gently. "We need to find out the truth." The next morning, Rachel found Evelyn in the hospital cafeteria, seated at a corner table with a cup of tea. She looked as composed as ever, her hair perfectly coiffed, her tailored blazer pristine. But there was a weariness in her posture that Rachel hadn't noticed before, a crack in her otherwise impenetrable facade. Evelyn glanced up as Rachel approached, her expression cool but curious. "Miss Connor," she said, her tone polite but distant, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Rachel slid into the seat across from her, meeting her gaze directly. "I need to talk to you about Emily." Evelyn's lips tightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't think that's any of your business." "It is when Gregory is suffering because of it," Rachel said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Evelyn, I spoke to Lillian. She told me what you said after Emily disappeared, that she was safe now. What did you mean by that?" Evelyn's eyes flashed, her composure slipping for the briefest moment. "I don't see how that's relevant." "It's relevant because Gregory deserves to know the truth," Rachel said, her tone softening. "Whatever happened to Emily, he needs closure. Don't you?" Evelyn's jaw tightened, and she looked away, her hands gripping the edges of her teacup. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on a distant point beyond Rachel's shoulder. Finally, she exhaled a shaky breath and spoke. "I did what I thought was best," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Gregory was spiraling. After Emily disappeared, he couldn't function. He was obsessed with finding her, with blaming himself. I thought if he believed she was safe, he could move on. Rachel's heart raced, her mind struggling to keep up. So you didn't know where she was? Evelyn's eyes met Rachel's, her expression pained. I didn't at first. But then, a few months later, I received a letter. A letter? Rachel leaned forward, her voice urgent. From who? Evelyn hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. From someone who claimed to have her. They said she was alive, that she was being cared for. But they didn't want her to come back. They said it would be better for her to start over, to have a life free from us. Rachel's chest tightened, a mixture of disbelief and anger surging within her. And you didn't tell Gregory? I couldn't, Evelyn said, her voice breaking. He would have gone mad trying to find her. And what if it wasn't true? What if it was some cruel joke? I couldn't take that risk. Rachel's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. You kept that from him for years. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her composure crumbling. I thought I was protecting him. I thought I was protecting both of us. Rachel stared at her, the weight of Evelyn's confession settling heavily in her chest. Do you still have the letter? Evelyn nodded slowly. It's in the safe at our house. I've kept it all these years. Rachel exhaled shakily, her mind racing. We need to show Gregory. He deserves to see it. Evelyn hesitated, her expression conflicted. But finally, she nodded. You're right. He does. That evening, Rachel sat with Gregory in his hospital room, her heart pounding as Evelyn handed him the letter. He unfolded it carefully, his hands trembling as he read. Rachel watched his face, her chest tightening as his expression shifted from confusion to pain, and finally to a glimmer of hope. She's alive, Gregory whispered, his voice thick with emotion. All this time. She's been alive. Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, her own eyes brimming with tears. We'll find her, Gregory. Whatever it takes, we'll find her. Evelyn stood by the window, her back to them, her shoulders hunched as if under an unbearable weight. For the first time, Rachel saw her not as an antagonist, but as a woman who had carried the unbearable burden of her choices for far too long. The truth had finally come to light, but the journey was far from over. For Gregory, for Evelyn, and for Rachel herself, the search for Emily had only just begun. The letter lay open on Gregory's lap, its worn edges and yellowed paper carrying the weight of years of secrecy. The words, penned in a hurried hand, were simple but devastating. Emily is safe. Do not search for her. She has a new life now, one far from the pain of her past. Gregory read the letter for what felt like the 100th time, his hands trembling as he held it. Rachel sat close by, her gaze flickering between him and Evelyn, who stood by the window with her arms crossed, her face pale and drawn. The room felt heavy with unspoken words, the air thick with tension. Why didn't you tell me? Gregory asked finally, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. His tone was soft, but the pain in it was undeniable. He looked up at Evelyn, his eyes filled with equal parts hurt and disbelief. Evelyn turned slowly, her face unreadable. I told you. I thought I was protecting you, she said, her voice low but steady. You were barely holding on, Gregory. If this letter had been a lie, if it had been another cruel twist of fate, I wasn't sure you could survive it. Gregory's hands clenched into fists around the letter. You had no right to make that decision for me. I know, Evelyn whispered, her composure faltering. But I did what I thought was best. For both of us. Rachel sat in silence, her chest tight as she watched the fractured pieces of their relationship come to light. She could see the raw grief etched into Evelyn's face, the weight of years of guilt and regret pressing down on her. But she also saw the pain in Gregory's eyes, the betrayal, the yearning for the truth he had been denied for so long. "I need to know more," Gregory said, his voice firmer now. "Who sent this? Where did it come from?" Evelyn hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. There was no name, no address. It was postmarked from a small town upstate, but that's all I know. Gregory's frustration bubbled to the surface, his voice rising. "And you didn't think to investigate, to follow the trail?" "I was scared, Gregory," Evelyn snapped, her voice cracking. "I was scared of what I might find, scared of what it would do to you. To us." Gregory slumped back against the pillows, the fight draining out of him. Rachel leaned forward, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Gregory," she said gently, "we have something now, a place to start. We can find out who sent this letter. We can find out where Emily is." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. "Do you really think it's possible?" Rachel nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I do. And I'll help you every step of the way." Evelyn watched them in silence, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. "If you go down this road," she said quietly, "you need to be prepared for what you might find. The truth might not be what you want it to be." "I've been living with unanswered questions for too long," Gregory said, his voice steady. "Whatever the truth is, I need to face it." The next morning, Rachel sat in the hospital's small library, surrounded by maps and directories. She had spent the early hours researching the town listed on the letter's postmark, tracing its history and demographics, searching for any clues that might lead them closer to Emily. The town, a quiet rural community tucked away in the hills, seemed an unlikely place for someone to vanish. And yet, it was their only lead. As Rachel sifted through the information, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Dr. Mark Tennyson approaching, his expression curious but concerned. "You've been spending a lot of time in here lately," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "What's going on?" Rachel hesitated, debating how much to tell him. But she knew she couldn't do this alone. Mark had proven himself to be a steady presence in her life, someone she could trust. "We found something," she said finally. "A letter. It might be a clue to where Emily is." Mark's eyebrows rose. "Emily? You mean Gregory's daughter?" Rachel nodded, her voice firm. "It's a long shot, but it's the first real lead we've had. The letter was postmarked from a town upstate. I'm trying to figure out if there's anyone there who might know something." Mark leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're really committed to this, aren't you?" "I have to be," Rachel said, her tone resolute. "Gregory deserves answers, and if there's even a chance we can find Emily, I have to try." Mark's expression softened, and he nodded. "Then let me help. I'm pretty good at tracking things down." Rachel smiled faintly, a small wave of relief washing over her. "Thanks, Mark. I could use the help." By the end of the day, Rachel and Mark had compiled a list of possible leads in the town, names and locations that might be connected to the mysterious letter. Rachel felt a flicker of hope as she looked over the list, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to come together. "We'll need to make the trip," Rachel said, glancing at Mark. "I can't do this over the phone. It's too sensitive." Mark nodded. "Agreed. When were you thinking?" "Tomorrow," Rachel said. "The sooner, the better." Mark gave her a small smile. "Then tomorrow it is." That evening, Rachel returned to Gregory's room, the list of leads tucked carefully into her bag. Gregory looked up as she entered, his eyes lighting up with quiet anticipation. "Did you find anything?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. "We did," Rachel said, sitting beside him. "It's not much, but it's a start. Mark and I are going to the town tomorrow to see what we can find." Gregory reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady. "Thank you, Rachel," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Rachel smiled, her own eyes brimming with tears. "We'll find her, Gregory, I promise." As she sat with him, the weight of the journey ahead settled over her. The road to finding Emily was uncertain, fraught with unanswered questions and the possibility of heartbreak. But Rachel knew one thing for certain. She would see this through to the end, for Gregory, for Emily, and for the fragile hope that bound them all together. The morning dawned cold and grey, the kind of day where the clouds felt heavy with unspent rain. Rachel pulled her coat tightly around her as she stepped out of her apartment, a bag slung over her shoulder with the essentials she had packed for the trip. Mark's car was already waiting at the curb, the engine idling softly. She climbed into the passenger seat, nodding a silent greeting. "You ready for this?" Mark asked as he shifted the car into gear. Rachel glanced out the window, her fingers fiddling with the strap of her bag. "Ready as I'll ever be." The drive to the small town was quiet at first, the silence between them filled with the low hum of the car engine. Rachel stared at the passing landscape, the sprawling suburbs giving way to rolling hills and dense woods. Her thoughts churned with what they might find, if they found anything at all. "Tell me what you're thinking," Mark said after a while, breaking the quiet. His tone was gentle, inviting. Rachel hesitated before speaking, her voice quiet. "I'm thinking about Gregory, about what this means to him. He's been carrying this weight for so long, and now we might actually have a chance to give him some closure." Mark nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "And what about you?" Rachel blinked, caught off guard. "What about me?" Mark glanced at her briefly before returning his focus to driving. "This isn't just about Gregory, is it? You're carrying something too." Rachel's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, her chest tightening. She looked out the window, her voice low. "I think part of me sees myself in Emily, or maybe in Gregory, that feeling of being lost, of not knowing where you belong. It's hard to explain." "You don't have to explain," Mark said softly. "I get it." Rachel turned to him, her expression softening. "Do you?" Mark nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "I've had my own share of unanswered questions, things I've carried longer than I should have. Sometimes helping someone else find their answers is the closest we can get to finding our own." Rachel studied him, surprised by the vulnerability in his words. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "For coming with me, for understanding." Mark smiled faintly, his eyes warm. "You don't have to do this alone, Rachel." "You never did." The small town was just as Rachel had imagined, quaint and quiet, with rows of modest homes and a main street lined with small shops. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the kind of clean, crisp scent that seemed worlds away from the city. Rachel and Mark parked near the center of town, the list of names and addresses in Rachel's hand. She studied it carefully, her pulse quickening with a mix of anticipation and nerves. "The first name on the list is just a few blocks from here," she said, pointing to a map on her phone. "An older woman named Margaret Adams. She's lived here for decades, according to the records." Mark nodded. "Let's start there." The walk to Margaret's house was short, the streets quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the rustle of leaves in the wind. When they arrived, Rachel hesitated at the gate, her fingers gripping the cold metal. "You okay?" Mark asked, his tone gentle. Rachel nodded, though her heart raced. "Yeah, let's do this." They approached the front door, and Rachel knocked lightly. Moments later, the door opened to reveal an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She wore a knitted cardigan and clutched a mug of tea in one hand. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice soft but curious. "Mrs. Adams?" Rachel asked, and the woman nodded. "My name is Rachel Connor, and this is Dr. Mark Tennyson. We're looking for information about someone who might have lived here years ago, Emily Hartwell." Margaret's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing over her face. She stepped back, motioning for them to come inside. "Emily," she said softly. "I remember that name. Come in, dear. Let's talk." Rachel and Mark followed her into the cozy living room, where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Margaret gestured for them to sit as she settled into an armchair, her mug resting on a side table. "I knew a little girl named Emily once," Margaret began, her eyes distant as she searched her memory. "But it was so long ago. She didn't stay here for very long." Rachel leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "Do you remember anything about her? Who she was with? Why she left?" Margaret frowned slightly, her hands clasping together in her lap. "She came here with a man and a woman. I don't think they were her parents, though. They didn't stay in town, just passed through. But I remember Emily because she was so quiet, so sad. She barely spoke a word." Rachel's heart clenched. "Did they say where they were going?" Margaret shook her head. "No, but I do remember the man saying something about needing to keep her safe. He seemed protective." Rachel exchanged a glance with Mark, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to take shape. "Do you remember their names?" she asked, her voice steady but urgent. Margaret hesitated before nodding. "The man's name was Arthur Bentley. He seemed like a decent enough man, though I got the sense he was running from something." Rachel's stomach churned. The name was unfamiliar, but it was a lead, one they couldn't afford to ignore. She thanked Margaret profusely, promising to follow up if they learned anything more. As they walked back to the car, Rachel's mind raced with possibilities. Arthur Bentley. Who was he? And why had he taken Emily? She looked at Mark, her voice filled with determination. "We need to find him," she said. "If he's still alive, he might have the answers we're looking for." Mark nodded, his expression equally resolute. "We will." One step at a time, Rachel climbed into the car, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, the path felt clear. Emily was out there, somewhere, and they were one step closer to finding her. The drive back to the city was quieter than the journey out, the weight of Margaret's revelations hanging heavy in the car. Rachel stared out the window, her thoughts a tangle of hope and apprehension. Arthur Bentley. The name felt both foreign and significant, like a faint trail that could lead to answers or to more questions than they could handle. Mark broke the silence, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "What do you make of this Arthur Bentley? If he was with Emily, why would he take her, and where?" Rachel shook her head, her brow furrowed. "I don't know. But Margaret said he seemed protective. Maybe he thought he was helping her, keeping her safe." "From what?" Mark pressed gently, glancing at her briefly before returning his focus to the road. "From Evelyn? From Gregory?" Rachel's chest tightened. "I don't think Gregory would have ever hurt Emily. Evelyn, I'm not sure. But it's possible Arthur thought Emily needed to get away from whatever was happening at home." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "So we find Arthur. If he's still alive, he's the missing piece." Rachel pulled out her notebook, where she had been jotting down every scrap of information they'd gathered. "We'll need to dig deeper. Records, archives, anything that can tell us where he might be now." Mark glanced at her again, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You've got that look again." "What look?" Rachel asked, raising an eyebrow. "The one that says you're not stopping until you figure this out," he said. "It's a good look." Rachel allowed herself a small smile. "Someone has to fight for Gregory, for Emily, for all of this." Mark's smile softened, and he reached out briefly to squeeze her hand. "You're doing more than fighting, Rachel. You're giving them hope." The next day, Rachel and Mark dove headfirst into their search for Arthur Bentley. They started at the Public Records Office, sifting through property deeds, census data, and anything else that might lead to a clue. The work was tedious, the kind of painstaking effort that demanded patience and focus. Rachel felt a growing sense of urgency, but she reminded herself to stay methodical. Every piece of the puzzle mattered. Hours later, Mark leaned back in his chair, a triumphant look on his face. "Got something." Rachel hurried over, her heart pounding. Mark tapped a page on the screen in front of him. "Arthur Bentley. There's a record of him owning a cabin in the woods about 30 miles from here. It's remote, perfect for someone trying to stay off the grid." Rachel's pulse quickened. "Do we have an address?" Mark nodded, scribbling it down on a piece of paper. "We do, but Rachel, if he's still there, we need to tread carefully. He might not be thrilled about being found." Rachel nodded, understanding the warning in his tone. "We'll be careful, but we have to try." The drive to the cabin took them deep into the countryside, the roads narrowing as the trees grew thicker and the air colder. Rachel gripped the map tightly, her nerves fraying with each passing mile. When they finally arrived, the cabin came into view, a small, weathered structure tucked away in a clearing. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, a sign of life. Mark parked the car a short distance away, turning to Rachel with a steadying look. "Are you ready?" Rachel swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. "As ready as I'll ever be." They approached the cabin cautiously, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet the only sound in the still air. Rachel knocked lightly on the door, her heart racing. For a moment, there was no response, and she began to wonder if the cabin was abandoned. But then the door creaked open, revealing an older man with a lined face and sharp, watchful eyes. He looked at them with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. "Arthur Bentley," Rachel asked, her voice steady despite the nerves knotting her stomach. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who's asking?" "My name is Rachel Connor," she said carefully. "This is Dr. Mark Tennyson. We're here about Emily Hartwell." The man's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before he masked it with a guarded look. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please," Rachel said, her voice softening, "we're not here to cause trouble. Gregory Hartwell, her father, is dying. He just wants to know the truth." "He deserves that much." Arthur's gaze flicked between them, his shoulders tense. Finally, he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in." The cabin was modest but cozy, with a small wood-burning stove and shelves lined with books and knickknacks. Arthur motioned for them to sit, pulling a chair over to join them. He studied Rachel for a long moment before speaking. "What do you know?" he asked finally, his voice low. Rachel met his gaze, her tone earnest. "We know Emily disappeared when she was a child. We know you were with her, at least for a while. And we know that Gregory has spent the rest of his life trying to figure out what happened." Arthur sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I didn't take her to hurt anyone," he said quietly. "I took her because she needed to get away, from Evelyn, from the fights, from the neglect." Rachel's chest tightened. "What happened to her?" Arthur hesitated, his eyes clouding with emotion. "I found a family for her, a good family. They took her in, gave her a fresh start. She was happy there." Rachel's heart raced. "Do you know where she is now? Is she still with them?" Arthur shook his head, his expression pained. "I don't know. I lost touch with them years ago. I thought it was best to leave well enough alone." Rachel exchanged a glance with Mark, her mind racing. "Do you remember their names? Anything that could help us find her?" Arthur nodded slowly. "The Anders family. They lived a few towns over. I can't promise they're still there, but it's a place to start." Rachel's heart swelled with hope. "Thank you, Arthur. This means more than you know." Arthur's gaze softened, and he nodded. "Just be careful." The past has a way of cutting deep, Rachel nodded, her resolve solidifying. We will. As they left the cabin, Rachel felt the weight of the next step pressing heavily on her shoulders. They were closer to Emily than ever, but the journey was far from over. The truth was within reach, and Rachel was determined to see it through, no matter what it revealed. Rachel and Mark stood by the car, the crisp afternoon air heavy with the weight of Arthur Bentley's revelation. Rachel clutched the paper where she had scrawled "The Anders family" in her hasty handwriting. The name felt both hopeful and tenuous, like a thread so fragile it could snap if they pulled too hard. Mark leaned against the car, studying Rachel as she stared down at the paper. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Rachel nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. I didn't expect this. A new family. A fresh start. It sounds too perfect." Mark frowned thoughtfully. "Arthur seems like a man who believes in what he did, but there's still a lot we don't know. Why would the Anders family lose touch? Did Emily ever know about Gregory?" Rachel's heart ached at the thought. She folded the paper and slipped it into her coat pocket. "We won't know until we find them." Mark nodded, his tone firm. "Then we find them. Let's get back to the city and start digging." Back at the hospital that evening, Rachel sat with Gregory, her mind racing with how much to share. He looked fragile tonight, his skin pale against the stark white of the hospital sheets. But his eyes held a flicker of hope that Rachel couldn't bear to extinguish. "What did you find?" Gregory asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel hesitated, pulling her chair closer to his bedside. "We spoke to Arthur Bentley," she said gently. "He remembers Emily. He says he took her to keep her safe." Gregory's breath hitched, his frail hands gripping the blanket. "Safe? From what?" Rachel hesitated, choosing her words carefully. From what he believed was a dangerous environment, he thought he was doing the right thing. Gregory's gaze dropped, his shoulders slumping. "And where is she now?" Rachel reached for his hand, her voice steady. "Arthur found a family for her, the Anders family. They took her in, gave her a new life. He said she was happy." Gregory closed his eyes, his expression a mix of relief and anguish. "All these years, I thought I'd failed her, but she was safe." Rachel's heart clenched at the raw emotion in his voice. "We're going to find her, Gregory. Arthur gave us their name. It's a lead, and we're following it." Gregory's eyes opened, filled with tears. "Thank you, Rachel," he whispered, "for not giving up." Rachel smiled softly, her own eyes glistening. "We're not done yet. We'll find her." The next morning, Rachel and Mark met at the hospital's staff lounge, their laptops and notepads spread across the table. Mark had spent the night pulling public records for the Anders family, and now they pored over the details together. "Here," Mark said, pointing to his screen, "James and Margaret Anders. They lived in Fairview, a small town about 50 miles from here. They adopted a child around the same time Arthur said he placed Emily with them." Rachel leaned in, her pulse quickening. "Do we have any current addresses? Phone numbers?" Mark frowned, scrolling through the documents. "Nothing recent. The last address on file is from almost 10 years ago. After that, they seem to drop off the radar." Rachel sighed, running a hand through her hair. "What about the adoption records? If Emily was legally adopted, there has to be a paper trail." Mark hesitated, his tone cautious. "Adoption records are sealed in this state. Without a court order, we won't get access." Rachel's shoulders slumped, frustration bubbling beneath her calm facade. "There has to be another way." Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "We could go to Fairview. If it's a small town, someone there might remember the Anders family. It's not much, but it's a start." Rachel nodded, her determination hardening. "Then we go today." Fairview was a quiet town nestled among rolling hills, its streets lined with charming shops and weathered houses. Rachel and Mark parked near the town square, where a small cafe bustled with locals enjoying their morning coffee. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, but Rachel felt a nervous energy prickling at her skin. Inside the cafe, Rachel approached the counter, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted her. "What can I get you, hon?" "Actually," Rachel began, her voice steady, "I was hoping you could help me. I'm looking for someone, a family that used to live here, the Anders family. Do you remember them?" The woman's smile faltered slightly, her brow furrowing. "The Anders family? Oh, yes, I remember them. Lovely people. They had a daughter, Emily." "Quiet girl, but sweet." Rachel's heart leapt. "Do you know where they are now?" The woman shook her head regretfully. "They moved away years ago. James passed, and Margaret decided to sell the house. I think they went south, maybe to stay with relatives." Rachel's hope dimmed, but she pressed on. "Do you know anyone who might have kept in touch with Margaret?" The woman thought for a moment. "You could try Mrs. Dunn. She's the town historian, knows everyone's business. She might be able to help." Rachel thanked her profusely, jotting down the address the woman provided. As they left the cafe, Mark glanced at her, his tone optimistic. "We're getting closer." Rachel nodded, clutching her notepad tightly. "Let's find Mrs. Dunn." Mrs. Dunn's house was a charming cottage on the edge of town, its front yard bursting with flowers despite the cool autumn air. The elderly woman welcomed them warmly, her sharp eyes twinkling with curiosity as Rachel explained their quest. "The Anders family," Mrs. Dunn said thoughtfully, sipping her tea. "Yes, I remember them well. Margaret was a dear friend. She moved to Florida a few years back to be closer to her sister." Rachel leaned forward, her voice filled with urgency. "Do you have her contact information?" Mrs. Dunn smiled, setting her teacup down. "As a matter of fact, I do. Margaret sends me a Christmas card every year. Let me fetch her address book." Rachel exchanged a hopeful glance with Mark as Mrs. Dunn shuffled off to retrieve the information. Moments later, she returned with a neatly written address and phone number. "Here you go, dear," Mrs. Dunn said, pressing the paper into Rachel's hands. "Give Margaret my regards when you speak to her." Rachel thanked her profusely, the weight of the next step pressing heavily on her chest. As they drove back to the city, Rachel clutched the address tightly, her thoughts racing. They were closer than ever to finding Emily, but the truth felt more fragile with every step. "She's out there," Rachel said softly, more to herself than to Mark. "We're going to find her." Mark glanced at her, his expression filled with quiet resolve. "We will. Together." Rachel stared at the address Mrs. Dunn had provided, the neatly written letters feeling like a lifeline. She sat across from Mark in the hospital's quiet cafeteria, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The two of them were poring over the information Mrs. Dunn had given them, the Florida address standing out like a beacon of hope. "She's real," Rachel murmured, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Margaret Anders is real, and we have a way to reach her." Mark leaned forward, his arms resting on the table. "We should call first. Show up unannounced, and we might scare her off. People don't always take well to strangers knocking on their door with big questions." Rachel nodded, though her nerves prickled at the thought. "What do I even say? Hi, I'm Rachel Connor, and I'm looking for the daughter you adopted decades ago. It feels impossible." Mark gave her a reassuring smile. "You'll figure it out. You're good with people, Rachel. Just be honest." Rachel let out a shaky laugh. "Honesty might not be enough here, Mark." "It's all we've got," he replied, his voice steady, "and sometimes it's more than enough." Later that afternoon, Rachel sat alone in her apartment, the phone resting on the table in front of her. She had dialed the number twice already, her finger hovering over the call button each time before she hung up. The fear of what might or might not happen gripped her like a vice. Finally, she took a deep breath and pressed the button, holding the phone to her ear. The dial tone seemed to stretch forever before a soft, tentative voice answered. "Hello?" Rachel's heart leapt into her throat. "Hi, is this Margaret Anders?" "Yes," the voice replied, cautious but polite. "Who's calling?" Rachel gripped the phone tightly, forcing her voice to remain steady. "My name is Rachel Connor. I know this might be strange, but I'm trying to find someone, a young girl you might have adopted years ago. Her name was Emily Hartwell." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Rachel's stomach twisted as the silence stretched, each passing second feeling like an eternity. "I'm sorry," Margaret said finally, her voice soft but guarded. "I think you've got the wrong person." Rachel's heart sank. "Please, Mrs. Anders. I spoke to someone who told me you took in a little girl named Emily. Her father, Gregory Hartwell, is my patient. He's dying. He just wants to know she's okay." Another long pause followed, and Rachel held her breath. When Margaret spoke again, her voice trembled. "Emily was our daughter," she said quietly. "We adopted her when she was just a little girl. But we never knew where she came from. The man who brought her to us. He said it was best if we didn't ask questions." Rachel's chest tightened with a mix of relief and heartbreak. "Do you know where she is now? Is she still with you?" Margaret's voice grew heavy with emotion. "She's not with us anymore. She moved out years ago, started a life of her own, but she's alive. She's happy." Tears stung Rachel's eyes, and she swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. "Do you have any way to contact her?" "Please, it's so important." There was a long hesitation before Margaret answered. "She lives in Orlando now. I have her address. I'll give it to you, but please, don't hurt her with this. She's built a good life, and I don't want to see her heartbroken." "I promise," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the tears slipping down her cheeks. "All I want is to help." Margaret recited the address, and Rachel jotted it down, her hand trembling. When the call ended, she sat in silence, staring at the piece of paper in her hand. Emily was alive, she was happy, and she was within reach. The next morning, Rachel met Mark outside the hospital, the address tucked safely into her bag. Gregory's condition had worsened overnight, and she felt the pressure of time pressing heavily against her. There wasn't a moment to lose. "You're sure about this?" Mark asked as they climbed into his car. "I don't have a choice," Rachel replied, her voice resolute. "Gregory deserves this." Mark nodded, starting the engine. "Then let's go." The drive to Orlando was long but filled with anticipation. Rachel clutched her bag tightly, her mind racing with how she might approach Emily. What would she say? How would Emily react? Would she even want to see Gregory? As they pulled into the quiet suburban neighborhood where Emily lived, Rachel felt her nerves spike. The house Margaret had described was modest and welcoming, with a small garden in the front yard. Rachel and Mark sat in the car for a moment, the weight of the moment sinking in. "You don't have to do this alone," Mark said gently, his gaze steady. Rachel shook her head. "I need to. She doesn't know you, and this is going to be hard enough as it is." Mark hesitated, but nodded. "I'll be here if you need me." Rachel stepped out of the car, her legs feeling shaky as she approached the front door. She took a deep breath, her hand hovering over the doorbell before finally pressing it. The chime echoed inside, and a moment later, the door opened. The woman who stood before her was in her late 20s, with kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately reminded Rachel of the photos Gregory had shown her. It was her. It had to be. "Hi, the woman said, her voice light but curious. "Can I help you?" Rachel swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Emily?" she asked tentatively. The woman frowned slightly, her brow furrowing. "Yes. Do I know you?" Rachel's voice trembled as she spoke. "My name is Rachel Connor. I work with someone who's been looking for you for a long time. Gregory Hartwell, your father." Emily's expression shifted, her eyes widening in shock. "My father?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel nodded, her own emotions threatening to spill over. "He's been searching for you for years, Emily. He never stopped. And now, he doesn't have much time left. He just wants to see you, to know you're okay." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, and she stepped back, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. I didn't know. I thought he didn't want me." Rachel shook her head, her voice firm. "That couldn't be further from the truth. He loves you, Emily, more than anything." For a moment, Emily stood frozen, her emotions warring visibly on her face. Then, finally, she nodded, her voice trembling. "I'll come with you." Relief flooded through Rachel, and she reached out, placing a comforting hand on Emily's arm. "Thank you," she said softly. "You don't know how much this will mean to him." As they walked back to the car, Rachel felt a quiet sense of triumph. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like they were truly on the path to healing, for Gregory, for Emily, and maybe even for herself. The car ride back to the hospital was silent, save for the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. Emily sat in the back seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She stared out the window, her reflection faint against the passing scenery, her expression a tangle of anticipation and fear. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, glancing back at Emily now and then. She could see the emotions playing across her face, the hope, the doubt, and the fragile vulnerability of someone confronting a past she'd long buried. "You're sure he wants to see me?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first thing she'd said since they'd left her house. Rachel turned slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "Emily, your father has spent his entire life searching for you. He's never stopped loving you. You mean everything to him." Emily swallowed hard, her hands tightening in her lap. I don't know what to say to him. What if he's disappointed? What if I'm not who he remembers?" Rachel's heart ached at the uncertainty in her voice. "He's not expecting you to be the same little girl he lost," Rachel said softly. "He just wants to know you're happy, that you're safe. That's all he's ever wanted." Mark glanced at Emily through the rearview mirror, his voice steady as he added, "You don't have to have all the answers right away. Just showing up, that's enough." Emily nodded, though her expression remained distant. She pressed her fingers against her temple, as if the weight of her thoughts was too much to bear. "It's strange. All my life, I told myself I didn't need to know where I came from, that it didn't matter. But now—" Rachel turned fully in her seat, her voice soft. "Now you have the chance to find out. That's a gift, Emily, for both of you." Emily looked at her, tears brimming in her eyes. She nodded, her lips pressed tightly together as she turned back to the window. When they arrived at the hospital, Rachel led the way to Gregory's room. Emily hesitated in the hallway, her hands shaking as she hovered near the door. Rachel stopped and turned to her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," Rachel said, her voice steady. "I'll be right here with you." Emily took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady herself. "Okay," she whispered. "I'm ready." Rachel opened the door gently, stepping inside with Emily following close behind. Gregory was awake, propped up against the pillows, his face pale but illuminated by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. His eyes flickered toward the door, and when they landed on Emily, they widened in disbelief. "Emily!" Gregory's voice cracked, the single word carrying a lifetime of longing. Emily froze, her hands trembling as she took a tentative step forward. "Dad!" she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. Gregory's eyes filled with tears, and he reached out a trembling hand toward her. "It's you. It's really you." Emily crossed the room slowly, as though afraid the moment might shatter if she moved too quickly. She reached his bedside, her own tears spilling down her cheeks as she took his hand in hers. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," Gregory said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're so beautiful." "So grown up." Emily let out a soft, broken laugh, her shoulders shaking as she sank into the chair beside him. "I thought you didn't want me," she said, her voice raw. "I thought you'd forgotten me." Gregory shook his head fiercely, his grip on her hand tightening. "Never," he said, his voice trembling. "Not for 1 second. I searched for you, Emily. I searched everywhere, but I couldn't find you. I thought I'd lost you forever." Emily's tears came harder now, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't know. I didn't know you were looking for me." Rachel stood near the doorway, her own chest tight with emotion, as she watched father and daughter bridge the chasm of years and pain. She saw Gregory's frailty, the toll his illness had taken on him, but she also saw the strength in his grip, the light that had returned to his eyes now that Emily was there. "You didn't lose me," Emily said finally, her voice muffled as she wiped her face. She looked at Gregory, her eyes red but filled with determination. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Gregory smiled through his tears, his expression softening as he gazed at her. "You have no idea how much that means to me." For the next hour they talked. Gregory asked her about her life, where she'd been, what she'd done. Emily spoke hesitantly at first, but as she saw the joy in her father's eyes, she opened up. She told him about her childhood with the Anders family, about the quiet life they had built for her. She told him about her career, her hobbies, the little things that made her happy. Every word seemed to bring Gregory back to life, his frail body energized by the connection he had so desperately longed for. Rachel watched quietly, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and pride. This was why she had pushed so hard, why she had refused to give up. The sight of Gregory and Emily together made every step of the journey worth it. Finally, as the hour grew late, Gregory's energy began to wane. Emily noticed and gently touched his arm. "You should rest," she said softly. Gregory shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm afraid to close my eyes," he said. "I don't want to wake up and find out this was all a dream." Emily squeezed his hand. "I'll be here when you wake up," she promised. "I'm not going anywhere." Gregory nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but filled with peace. As his breathing evened out, Emily looked over at Rachel, her expression a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to repay you for this." Rachel smiled softly, shaking her head. "You just did. Seeing the two of you together, that's enough." As they left the room, Emily paused in the hallway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "He looks so fragile," she said quietly. "I don't know how much time we have." Rachel placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice gentle. "Then make the most of it. Every moment counts." Emily nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "I will. I promise." Rachel watched as Emily walked down the hallway, her back straight, her steps steady. For the first time in years, Rachel felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The pieces of Gregory's shattered life were coming back together, and she had played a part in making it happen. But there was more to come. The journey wasn't over yet. Not for Gregory, not for Emily, and not for Rachel herself. Emily arrived at the hospital early the next morning, a coffee cup in one hand and a small bouquet of white lilies in the other. The bright flowers seemed to catch every eye in the bustling corridors as she walked to Gregory's room. Rachel was already there when she arrived, standing near the window with her arms crossed, deep in thought. "Good morning," Emily said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. Rachel turned, a faint smile softening her expression. "Morning." "You're here early?" Emily set the flowers on the small table by Gregory's bed and smoothed her coat. "I didn't want to waste any time," she said, her tone steady but tinged with unease. "There's so much I want to say, but I don't know where to start." Rachel moved closer, her voice low and reassuring. "Start with what's in your heart. He's been waiting to hear from you for a long time." Emily nodded, her gaze shifting to Gregory. He was still asleep, his breathing slow and even, but his face seemed more peaceful than it had been the day before. She sank into the chair beside his bed, her fingers brushing against his as she reached for his hand. "I don't even know if I'm ready for this," Emily admitted, her voice barely audible. "It's overwhelming." Rachel crouched beside her, her hand resting lightly on Emily's arm. "Take it one moment at a time," she said. You're here now, and that's what matters." As if on cue, Gregory stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. He blinked against the morning light, his gaze slowly focusing on Emily. A soft smile crossed his face, and his hand tightened weakly around hers. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice a faint rasp. "Good morning," Emily replied, her voice trembling. "I brought you flowers. I remember you always liked lilies." Gregory's eyes flickered to the bouquet, and a faint chuckle escaped him. "You remembered," he said softly. "They're beautiful, Emily." "Thank you." Rachel stepped back, giving them space as Emily began to talk. She spoke haltingly at first, recounting small memories of her childhood, things she thought she had forgotten but that now came flooding back. Gregory listened intently, his face alight with joy and sorrow. "I remember you reading to me," Emily said, her voice growing stronger. "Before bed, you always had this old book of fairy tales. I think my favorite was... what was it called?" Gregory's lips curved into a wistful smile. "The Snow Queen," he said. "You loved that story. I must have read it 100 times." Emily laughed softly, her eyes glistening with tears. "I don't know why I liked it so much. It always scared me a little." "You liked how it ended," Gregory said. "How they found each other again despite everything?" The words hung in the air, laden with meaning. Emily's grip on his hand tightened, and she lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, "for all the years you had to wonder, for all the time we lost." Gregory's voice cracked as he replied, "None of that matters now. You're here, Emily. That's all I've ever wanted." Later that day, Rachel found herself standing in the hospital courtyard, the crisp autumn air a welcome relief from the emotions swirling inside her. Mark appeared beside her, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to her without a word, leaning against the railing as they watched the leaves drift lazily to the ground. "How's it going in there?" Mark asked finally, breaking the silence. Rachel sighed, her breath visible in the cool air. "Better than I expected," she said, "but it's still hard. There's so much between them, so many years to bridge." Mark nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "That's the thing about time. It doesn't erase anything, just piles more on top." Rachel glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "You're surprisingly philosophical today." He smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "Maybe it's seeing you fight so hard for something good." "It's contagious." Rachel looked away, her chest tightening. "It's not just for Gregory and Emily," she admitted. I think part of me needed this too, to prove that healing is possible." Mark tilted his head, studying her. "And has it proved that? I mean..." Rachel smiled faintly, her voice soft. "I think it's starting to." That evening, Emily stayed by Gregory's bedside long after visiting hours had ended. She listened as he shared stories of his life, his career, his regrets, the moments of joy and pain that had shaped him. Each story felt like a small window into the man he was, the man she had never known but now felt desperate to understand. "I wasn't a perfect father," Gregory said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "I made so many mistakes, Emily, but losing you, it taught me what really mattered. I just wish I'd learned it sooner." Emily shook her head, her tears spilling freely now. "You don't have to explain," she said. "I understand more than you think." Gregory's eyes filled with tears, and he smiled faintly. "I'm proud of you, Emily. You've built a life for yourself, a good life. That's all I ever wanted." Emily leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "I'm proud of you too, Dad, for never giving up." Rachel stood just outside the room, watching through the small window in the door. Her heart ached with the bittersweet beauty of the scene before her. She had fought so hard for this moment, for Gregory to see his daughter, for Emily to know her father's love. And now, as she witnessed their connection, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment, even as a flicker of sadness lingered. "Rachel," a soft voice said behind her. She turned to see Evelyn standing there, her face pale and strained. Rachel hadn't seen her since the letter was revealed, and the sight of her now stirred a mix of emotions. "I need to talk to him," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "Before it's too late." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "They're talking now, but when they're done, I'll let you know." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded. "Thank you." "For everything?" Rachel watched her retreat down the hall, a shadow of the composed, commanding woman she had first met. The years of secrets and pain had taken their toll, but perhaps there was still a chance for healing, for all of them. As Rachel turned back to the window, she saw Emily laughing softly, her hand resting lightly on Gregory's. The fragile threads of their bond had held, despite the years and the distance. And as Rachel stood there, she realized something else. Those threads were growing stronger with every word, every moment, every shared memory. The past might have been fractured, but here, in this room, a new beginning was taking root. The next morning, Rachel arrived early at the hospital, the sunrise painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. The quiet corridors were just beginning to hum with activity, nurses exchanging greetings and doctors huddling over charts. Rachel carried a small bag of pastries she had picked up on the way, hoping to coax Gregory into eating something. But when she stepped into his room, she found Emily already there, her hand resting lightly on Gregory's as he dozed. Emily looked up at the sound of the door opening, her expression softening when she saw Rachel. "He had a rough night," she said quietly. "The nurse said he was in pain." Rachel set the bag down and approached the bed, her chest tightening at the sight of Gregory's pale face. His breathing was shallow, his frailty more pronounced than it had been just the day before. "He's pushing himself too hard," Rachel murmured. "He doesn't want to waste a single moment with you." Emily's gaze dropped, her fingers tightening slightly around Gregory's. "I feel like I've only just found him, and now I'm losing him all over again." Rachel placed a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. "He's holding on because of you. He's finding peace in having you here." Gregory stirred then, his eyes fluttering open. When he saw Emily and Rachel standing over him, a faint smile touched his lips. "Good morning, ladies," he rasped, his voice weak but warm. "Morning, Dad," Emily said, her voice trembling as she leaned closer. "How are you feeling?" Gregory chuckled softly, though it turned into a faint cough. "I've been better, but seeing you here makes it worth it." Rachel stepped back, giving them space. She busied herself with arranging the flowers on the table, but her mind stayed firmly on the two of them. Emily had barely left Gregory's side since their reunion, and Rachel could see how much it meant to him. Yet she also saw the toll it was taking on Emily, who carried a mixture of guilt, love, and grief in every glance. As the morning wore on, Rachel left the room briefly to grab a coffee. When she returned, she found Evelyn standing in the hallway, her expression tense. She was clutching a small box in her hands, the edges of the cardboard fraying as though it had been handled countless times. "Evelyn," Rachel said softly, pausing a few feet away. Evelyn turned to her, her eyes sharp but filled with an emotion Rachel couldn't quite place. "I've been carrying this around for years," Evelyn said, her voice tight. "It's time he had it." Rachel stepped closer, her gaze dropping to the box. "What is it?" Evelyn hesitated, her fingers running over the edge of the box. "It's Emily's things. The few things I couldn't bear to part with after she disappeared." Rachel's breath caught, her heart aching at the vulnerability in Evelyn's voice. "I think he'll want to see it, and Emily too." Evelyn nodded, her jaw tightening. I don't know if I can face him after everything." Rachel placed a hand on Evelyn's arm, her voice steady. "You've carried this burden for too long, Evelyn. You deserve to find peace too." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. Together they entered the room, where Gregory and Emily were talking quietly. Both of them looked up at the sound of the door opening, their gazes sharpening when they saw Evelyn. "Evelyn," Gregory said, his voice soft but tinged with surprise. Emily stiffened slightly, her hand instinctively pulling back from Gregory's. But Evelyn's focus was on Gregory as she stepped closer, the box cradled in her hands like something precious. "I brought something for you," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. She placed the box on the table beside the bed and opened it carefully, revealing a collection of items, photos, a small stuffed bear, and a worn drawing of a house with stick figures labeled Mommy, Daddy, and Emily. Gregory's breath hitched as he reached for the drawing, his frail fingers tracing the lines. Tears welled in his eyes, and his voice broke as he said, "Emily drew this when she was little. She used to show me every picture she made." "I kept it," Evelyn said, her voice cracking. "I kept it all because I couldn't let go. Even when I wanted to hate you for not finding her, I couldn't let go of her." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she reached for the drawing, her hand brushing against Gregory's. "I remember this," she said, her voice trembling. "I drew it after we went to the park. I thought it would make you and Mom happy." Evelyn's face crumpled, and she looked away, her hands trembling. "You did make us happy, Emily. We didn't know how to show it. We failed you in so many ways." Emily stood slowly, her tears spilling freely now. "You didn't fail me. You did what you thought was best. I know that now." Evelyn looked up, her eyes wide and filled with disbelief. "Emily, I'm so sorry." Emily crossed the room and hugged Evelyn tightly, the years of pain and resentment dissolving into the quiet embrace. Rachel felt her own throat tighten as she watched, her chest swelling with a bittersweet mix of emotions. For the first time, the fractured pieces of this family seemed to be coming together. Later that evening, as the room grew quiet and Gregory drifted into a peaceful sleep, Rachel stood at the window with Emily. The two of them looked out at the city lights, their reflections faint against the glass. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice soft but filled with sincerity, "for bringing us back together, for not giving up on us." Rachel smiled, her chest warming at the words. "You're the one who made the choice to be here, Emily. That takes courage." Emily glanced at her, her expression thoughtful. "What about you? You've given so much to us, but what about your own story? Who's helping you heal?" Rachel hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I think this is part of my healing," she said finally. Seeing you and Gregory find each other, it's shown me that even the deepest wounds can mend." Emily reached out, her hand resting lightly on Rachel's arm. "You deserve that too." Rachel nodded, her throat tight. "One step at a time." As the night deepened, Rachel felt a sense of quiet fulfillment settle over her. The road to this moment had been long and fraught with pain, but it had led them here, to reconciliation, to hope, and to the fragile beginnings of a new chapter. And for the first time, Rachel allowed herself to believe that the journey had been worth it. The hospital room was quiet, the soft hum of machines blending with the rhythmic beeping of Gregory's heart monitor. The air was heavy with unspoken emotion, each moment feeling like it carried more weight than the last. Rachel sat in the corner, her notebook in her lap, but her attention was fixed on the people gathered around Gregory's bed. Emily sat closest to him, her hand resting lightly on his. Evelyn stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as though bracing herself against an invisible storm. The tension between the three of them had softened, but the room still carried the raw vulnerability of fragile bonds being tested. Gregory stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. His eyes found Emily first, and a small, weary smile crossed his face. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice faint but warm. Emily leaned closer, her own smile trembling at the edges. "Morning, Dad. How are you feeling?" "Tired," he admitted, his gaze shifting to Evelyn, "but happy. Seeing you both here, it's more than I could have hoped for." Evelyn stepped forward, her posture stiff, but her expression softening. "We're here, Gregory," she said quietly. "For you. For Emily." Gregory's eyes glistened, and he reached for Evelyn's hand. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, her fingers curling around his. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking, "for bringing her back to me." Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched the moment unfold. She had witnessed so much pain in this family, so many years of silence and regret, and now she saw the first fragile threads of healing taking root. It was bittersweet, knowing how little time Gregory had left, but she clung to the hope that these moments would leave a lasting mark on those he loved. "Rachel," Gregory said, his voice drawing her attention. His eyes found hers, and he smiled faintly. "Come closer." She set her notebook aside and moved to his bedside, her heart pounding. "I'm here," she said softly. "You've done more for me than I ever thought possible," he said, his gaze steady despite his fading strength. "You've given me my daughter back. You've given me peace." Rachel swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with tears. "You gave me a purpose, Gregory," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Helping you brought me back to life in ways I didn't know I needed." He nodded slowly, his smile widening just a fraction. "You're one of the best people I've ever known, Rachel. Don't ever forget that." She reached for his hand, her own trembling. "I won't." Later that day, Emily and Evelyn left the room to grab coffee, leaving Rachel alone with Gregory. He had fallen asleep again, his breathing shallow but even. Rachel sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the bed. She didn't know how much longer he had, but she could feel the inevitability of the end pressing closer with each passing moment. The door creaked open, and Mark stepped inside, his presence grounding as always. He carried a cup of tea, which he set on the small table near Rachel. "I thought you might need this," he said, his voice low. Rachel smiled faintly, her gratitude evident. "Thank you." Mark pulled a chair over and sat beside her, his gaze flickering to Gregory. "How's he doing?" "He's holding on," Rachel said softly, "but I don't think it'll be much longer." Mark nodded, his expression somber. "You've done everything you could, Rachel, more than anyone could have asked." Rachel's voice trembled as she replied, "It doesn't feel like enough." Mark placed a comforting hand on her arm, his voice firm but gentle. "It is. You brought him peace, Rachel. You gave him what he needed most." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks as she leaned into the comfort of his presence. "I just wish I could give him more time." That evening, Gregory's condition worsened. The doctors adjusted his medication to keep him comfortable, and the nurses made sure his room was quiet and dim. Emily sat beside him, her head resting against the bed as she whispered stories from her life. Evelyn stood by the window, her gaze distant, but her presence a steady reminder of her love for him. Rachel lingered near the door, watching the family she had come to care for so deeply. She felt like an outsider in this moment, but she also knew she had played a part in bringing them together. It was enough. Gregory stirred again, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at Emily, then Evelyn, and finally Rachel. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke. "I'm not afraid." Emily's tears fell freely as she clutched his hand. "We're here, Dad. We won't leave you." Gregory's gaze softened, his expression peaceful. "I love you," he said, his voice filled with a quiet strength that belied his frailty. "Both of you." Evelyn stepped closer, her tears falling silently as she rested a hand on his shoulder. "We love you too, Gregory," she said, her voice breaking. "Always?" Rachel moved to his other side, placing a hand gently over his. "You're surrounded by love, Gregory," she said softly. "You're not alone." His breathing slowed, each breath shallower than the last. The room was filled with a deep, sacred silence as they watched him slip away, his face serene. When his chest finally stilled, Emily let out a quiet sob, her head bowing against the bed. Rachel closed her eyes, her own tears falling freely. She felt the weight of the moment, the finality of loss mixed with the beauty of connection. Gregory was gone, but he had left behind something profound, a family that had begun to heal, a legacy of love that would endure. The days that followed were a blur of arrangements and farewells. Gregory's funeral was small, but filled with warmth, his friends and family gathering to celebrate the life he had lived. Emily spoke at the service, her words a heartfelt tribute to the father she had found again. Evelyn stood by her side, their connection tentative but growing. Afterward, Rachel found herself alone in the cemetery, standing by Gregory's grave. The autumn leaves swirled around her, the air crisp and filled with the faint scent of pine. "You did it," Mark said behind her, his voice breaking the quiet. He stepped closer, his coat pulled tightly against the chill. "You gave him what he needed." Rachel nodded, her gaze fixed on the headstone. "I just wish it didn't have to end." Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, his presence steady and grounding. "It doesn't end, Rachel. Not really. You've changed their lives, Emily's, Evelyn's, even your own. That doesn't go away." She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "Thank you for everything." Mark smiled, his voice soft. "You don't have to thank me. You just have to keep moving forward." As they stood together in the fading light, Rachel felt a sense of quiet resolution settle over her. The journey had been long and fraught with pain, but it had also been filled with moments of profound connection and love. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew she would carry Gregory's lessons with her, about forgiveness, about hope, and about the enduring power of family. The weeks after Gregory's funeral passed in a quiet blur, the world outside moving forward, while Rachel found herself lingering in the stillness of reflection. She spent her days at the hospital, falling back into the routine of caring for her patients. But she carried Gregory's story with her everywhere. His death had left an ache in her chest, but it was one tempered by the knowledge that he had found peace in his final days. Emily stayed in town for a while, tethered by the fragile connections she had begun to rebuild with Evelyn. The two of them had started to spend more time together, sharing tentative conversations that grew into deeper truths. Rachel often watched them from a distance, marveling at how grief had opened doors between them rather than closing them. One evening, Rachel sat in the hospital cafeteria, a stack of patient charts in front of her. The room was nearly empty, the soft hum of the vending machines the only sound. She had just taken a sip of lukewarm tea when Mark slid into the chair across from her, a faint smile on his face. "You're still here," he said, his tone light but his gaze curious. Rachel shrugged, setting her mug down. "There's always something to do." Mark leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "You've been quieter lately. Reflective." Rachel smiled faintly. "It's hard not to be." "Everything with Gregory, it changed me," he nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You put so much of yourself into helping him, into bringing Emily and Evelyn back together. That kind of thing leaves a mark." Rachel's voice softened. "It's strange. I thought losing him would feel like the end of something, but it doesn't. It feels like the beginning." Mark tilted his head, studying her. "The beginning of what?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. "I don't know yet, but I feel like I'm finally ready to figure it out." Mark smiled, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "That's the Rachel I know, always moving forward." A week later, Emily stopped by Rachel's apartment unannounced. She carried a small box, the edges worn, and her expression was a mix of excitement and nervousness. Rachel welcomed her inside, leading her to the cozy living room. "I didn't mean to drop in like this," Emily said, setting the box on the coffee table, "but I found something I thought you should have." Rachel sat beside her, curiosity flickering. "What is it?" Emily opened the box, revealing a collection of letters, photographs, and small trinkets. "It's from Dad," she said softly. "Things he saved over the years, things he wanted you to have." Rachel's breath caught as she reached for one of the letters, her fingers trembling slightly. She unfolded it carefully, recognizing Gregory's handwriting immediately. The words were heartfelt and raw, filled with gratitude for her role in his life. "I never knew he wrote these," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. "He wrote them for you," Emily said, her eyes glistening. "I think it was his way of making sure you knew how much you meant to him." Rachel read the letter slowly, her chest tightening with every word. It spoke of his admiration for her strength, his gratitude for her unwavering support, and his hope that she would find her own happiness. "Thank you," Rachel whispered, looking up at Emily, "for sharing this with me." Emily smiled, her own tears spilling over. "It's the least I could do. You gave me back my father, Rachel. I'll never be able to thank you enough for that." Over the next few weeks, Rachel found herself spending more time with Emily and Evelyn. The three of them often met for coffee or lunch, their conversations weaving between shared memories of Gregory and the lives they were trying to rebuild. Evelyn was softer now, her once hardened edges smoothed by grief and the reconciliation she had found with her daughter. One afternoon, they sat together in a small cafe, the sunlight streaming through the windows. Evelyn sipped her tea thoughtfully before speaking. "I've been thinking about something Gregory used to say," she began, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "He always believed that life was about connections, about finding the people who make you feel whole." Emily reached for her mother's hand, a small smile on her lips. "He was right." Rachel listened quietly, a warmth spreading through her chest. She thought of all the connections she had made through Gregory, of the way his story had intertwined with hers in ways she could never have predicted. It was a reminder of the power of human connection, of the resilience that could be found even in the face of loss. One evening, as Rachel walked home from the hospital, she stopped at the park where she and Gregory had once sat. The air was crisp, the leaves turning shades of gold and red. She sat on a bench, watching as children played on the swings, their laughter echoing through the cool air. Mark appeared a few minutes later, his coat pulled tightly around him. He sat beside her without a word, the silence between them comfortable. "I thought I'd find you here," he said finally, his voice low. Rachel smiled faintly. "It's a good place to think." Mark nodded, his gaze drifting to the playground. "You've done something incredible, Rachel. Not just for Gregory, but for yourself." She glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "You've found your way back," he said simply, "to who you are, to what matters." Rachel's chest tightened, her eyes glistening. "I don't think I could have done it without you, Mark." "You've been there every step of the way." He smiled, his voice warm. "That's what friends are for." They sat in silence for a while, the fading light casting long shadows across the park. For the first time in years, Rachel felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that she was on the right path. Gregory's story had taught her so much about love, forgiveness, and the strength it took to move forward. And now, as she looked ahead to the future, she knew she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The journey wasn't over, but Rachel was no longer afraid. She carried Gregory's lessons with her, a reminder that even in the face of loss, there was always the possibility of new beginnings. And in that moment, as the stars began to dot the evening sky, she felt a quiet hope take root in her heart. A hope that would guide her toward the horizon, one step at a time. It had been 6 months since Gregory's passing, and life had slowly shifted into a new rhythm for everyone he had left behind. The grief was still there, but it was softer now, no longer an all-consuming storm, but a quiet, steady undercurrent. Rachel sat in her apartment, the morning light spilling across her desk as she sifted through the letters Gregory had left her. Each one felt like a conversation with him, his words a reminder of the strength and purpose she had found in helping him heal. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. Emily's name flashed on the screen, and Rachel answered with a smile. "Hi, Emily." "Hey, Rachel," Emily replied, her tone warm but tinged with excitement. "Are you free this afternoon? There's something I want to show you." Rachel glanced at her planner, though her answer was already certain. "I can be. What's going on?" "You'll see," Emily said, a hint of mischief in her voice. "Meet me at the old Hartwell house around 2. Rachel hesitated. She hadn't been to Gregory's house since his passing, and the thought of returning stirred a mix of emotions. But there was something in Emily's tone, something hopeful, that made her agree. "I'll be there." When Rachel arrived at the Hartwell house, the sight of it took her breath away. The once quiet property was bustling with activity. Workers carried supplies in and out, and the sound of hammering echoed faintly from somewhere inside. The garden, which had been overgrown with weeds the last time she saw it, was now neatly trimmed, the flower beds bursting with life. Emily stood on the porch, waving as Rachel approached. She was wearing jeans and a paint-splattered shirt, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She looked lighter, freer, as though the weight of the past had finally begun to lift. "What's all this?" Rachel asked, motioning to the flurry of activity. Emily grinned, stepping aside to let Rachel inside. "Come see for yourself." Inside, the house was alive with transformation. The walls were freshly painted, the furniture rearranged, and the air filled with the faint scent of sawdust and new beginnings. It was as though the house itself was waking up after years of slumber. "I'm turning it into a community center," Emily explained, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. "A place where people can come together, connect and heal. It's what Dad would have wanted." Rachel's heart swelled as she looked around. "Emily, this is incredible. He'd be so proud of you." Emily's smile softened, and she nodded. "It feels like a way to honor him, to give back the love and support he always tried to give me, even when I didn't know it. Rachel reached out, squeezing Emily's hand. You're building something beautiful here. Emily led Rachel through the house, showing her the progress that had been made. The old study was being converted into a resource library, while the dining room was set to become a gathering space for workshops and events. Each room told a story of renewal, of hope taking root in a place that had once been filled with so much pain. As they walked through the house, Emily paused in what had once been Gregory's bedroom. The space was quiet now, the bed stripped and the shelves empty. She turned to Rachel, her expression wistful. This was his sanctuary, Emily said softly. I used to think it was where he hid from the world, but now I realize it was where he found his strength. Rachel nodded, her gaze sweeping the room. He left his mark here, and now you're carrying it forward. Emily smiled, her eyes glistening. I hope so. Later that afternoon, Emily and Rachel sat on the porch, sipping lemonade as the workers wrapped up for the day. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the property. Rachel felt a deep sense of contentment as she listened to Emily talk about her plans for the center, her hopes, her dreams, the people she wanted to help. I think you found your calling, Rachel said, her voice filled with admiration. Emily laughed softly. Maybe. It's funny. If you told me a year ago that I'd be here, doing this, I wouldn't have believed you. But now, it feels right. Rachel smiled, her own thoughts drifting. Sometimes the hardest journeys lead us exactly where we're meant to be. Emily looked at her, her expression thoughtful. What about you, Rachel? What's next for you? Rachel hesitated, the question catching her off guard. She had spent so much time focusing on Gregory and Emily that she hadn't allowed herself to think about her own path. But as she sat there, surrounded by the warmth of renewal, she felt a quiet certainty begin to form. I think I want to keep helping people find their way, she said slowly, like I did with Gregory. There's something so meaningful about being part of someone's healing journey. Emily nodded, her smile widening. You're good at it. You have a gift for bringing people together. Rachel's heart swelled at the compliment. Thank you, Emily. That means a lot. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sky deepened into shades of pink and purple. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, the sound of birds chirping in the distance. It felt like a moment suspended in time, a reminder of all they had overcome and all they had to look forward to. That evening, Rachel returned home with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She sat at her desk, opening her notebook to a fresh page. The words came easily, flowing from her pen like a stream. Healing isn't a destination, it's a journey. It's the quiet moments of connection, the courage to face the past, and the strength to build something new. Gregory taught me that. Emily showed me that, and now it's my turn to carry it forward. As she wrote, Rachel felt a quiet peace settle over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. She had found her own way back, and now she was ready to help others do the same. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. With every step, every connection, she was moving toward a future filled with possibility, a future Gregory would have been proud of. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, Rachel allowed herself to dream of all the lives she might touch, all the stories yet to unfold. Rachel stood in the middle of the Hartwell Community Center's main hall, the scent of fresh paint still lingering in the air. The space was transformed, bright, open and inviting. Rows of chairs were arranged neatly, a small stage at the front, adorned with a simple banner that read, Grand Opening, honoring Gregory Hartwell's legacy. The event was scheduled to begin in less than an hour, and volunteers were busy adding the final touches. Emily appeared at Rachel's side, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of equal parts excitement and nervousness. "I think we're almost ready," she said, scanning the room. "It's hard to believe this is actually happening," Rachel smiled, her gaze sweeping over the space. "You've done something incredible here, Emily. Gregory would be so proud." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening. "I hope so. I wanted this to be a place where people feel seen, where they feel like they belong. That's what he wanted for me, and now I can share it with others." Rachel reached out, squeezing Emily's hand. "You're carrying his legacy forward in the best way possible." As the doors opened and guests began to trickle in, the room buzzed with energy. Rachel recognized many familiar faces: hospital staff who had cared for Gregory, neighbors who had known him for years, even a few former colleagues who had traveled to be there. Evelyn arrived shortly after looking poised but softer than Rachel had ever seen her. She and Emily exchanged a brief, warm hug before Evelyn quietly took a seat near the front. Mark arrived moments later, weaving through the growing crowd to find Rachel. He was dressed casually but neatly, his smile widening when he spotted her. "Looks like quite the turnout," he said, sliding his hands into his pockets. "It is," Rachel replied, her voice tinged with pride. "Emily's done an amazing job." Mark glanced around, nodding appreciatively. "And you helped her get here. Don't sell yourself short." Rachel smiled faintly but said nothing. She watched as Emily took the stage, her confidence evident in the way she addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," Emily began, her voice clear but filled with emotion. "This center is more than just a building. It's a place for healing, for connection, and for growth. It's a reflection of the values my father believed in: kindness, resilience, and the power of community." The audience was silent, captivated by her words. "I lost my father for many years," Emily continued, her voice softening. "But in the end, I found him again, and through him, I found myself. This center is my way of keeping his spirit alive and giving others the chance to find their own paths." The room erupted into applause, and Rachel felt a swell of pride as she joined in. Emily's journey had been a difficult one, but she had emerged stronger, her heart open to the possibilities of the future. After the speeches and formalities, the event shifted into a more casual gathering. Guests mingled, explored the newly renovated rooms, and shared stories about Gregory. Rachel wandered through the crowd, her heart full as she listened to the impact one man's life had had on so many others. She found herself in the library room, where a small display had been set up featuring Gregory's favorite books, photos, and personal mementos. A framed picture of Gregory and Emily sat at the center, taken during their brief but precious time together after their reunion. Rachel's eyes lingered on the photo, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. "You've been quiet," Mark's voice came from behind her. Rachel turned to see him standing in the doorway, his arms crossed casually. "Just taking it all in," she replied, motioning to the display. "It's amazing how much one person can affect so many lives." Mark stepped closer, his gaze thoughtful. "You've done that too, you know. Gregory, Emily, even Evelyn, you brought them together. And now, this center exists because of that." Rachel shook her head, her voice modest. "I didn't do it alone." "No," Mark agreed, his voice softening. "But you were the spark." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Rachel spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about what's next for me." Mark raised an eyebrow. "And I want to do more of this," Rachel said, her voice growing firmer. "Helping people find healing, finding their way forward. Maybe not on the same scale as this, but I think it's my calling." Mark smiled, his pride evident. "I think you're right, and I think you'll be incredible at it." Rachel felt her cheeks flush slightly, but she met his gaze. Thank you, Mark. For everything, always, he replied, his tone warm. As the event wound down and the last of the guests began to leave, Rachel found herself sitting on the front steps of the center, the cool evening air wrapping around her. The sky was streaked with the deep purples and blues of twilight, and the stars were just beginning to peek through. Emily joined her, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. She passed one to Rachel and sat down beside her. "I think today was a success," Emily said, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. Rachel nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "More than a success. It was a testament to everything you've built." Emily looked at her, her expression earnest. "I couldn't have done it without you, Rachel. You gave me the courage to face my past and the strength to build something new." Rachel smiled, her chest tightening with emotion. "You've given me just as much, Emily. Watching you and Gregory find each other, it reminded me of why I do what I do." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the day settling into a peaceful stillness. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice soft but resolute. "I think he's with us, in all of this." Rachel nodded, her eyes glistening. "I think so too." As the stars brightened overhead, Rachel felt a quiet sense of fulfillment take root within her. The journey that had begun with Gregory's plea for help had led to something far greater than she could have imagined, a story of love, healing, and the enduring power of connection. And as she sat beside Emily, the future stretching out before them, she knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with possibility, purpose, and the threads of a legacy that would never fade. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.